All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. Once again, I am joined by James Tunney, author, mystic, painter, speaker. So many different titles that we could use to describe his work. Um, and his new book, Plantation of the Automatons, that has been released. I know we talked a little bit about that on the last episode. James, such a pleasure to always connect, continue the dialogue, and I'm excited to see where we end up.
Uh, Great to see you again, Evan, my friend, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And it's great that we have laid a foundation on which to progress a bit further.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think a good starting point maybe is to build on that foundation, maybe rehash some of the key points, but talk about the evolution of where it is that we are. I think a big theme for our chat today is looking at the technocratic dystopian ideals that are emerging around us, but then really build a resistance and spiritual evolution and personal growth as a resistance to that. And we'll certainly dive into that. But, I think a good starting point could be to lay some of those foundational aspects. And, where do you see that we're at today? And what are some of those key points of awareness that people need to make note of?
Yeah, I agree. If we're going to begin to anticipate and contemplate the future, where we're going, how we might resist in a non-violent way the unfolding dystopia, I think we have to have a proper analysis of what's happening. And as you know, I've made a quite clear case, I think, in my view, a specific, fairly specific origin and trajectory of the origin of this dystopian trend. So one of the problems is when you hear a lot of different analysis is that they report what's happening presently, but fail to articulate a coherent policy. And that means that they're always firefighting, always responding to the latest crisis. And to a certain extent, you can end up serving the goals of the dystopian creators, the tech totalitarians, by just dispiriting people, by describing what's happening as opposed to analyzing with a view to correcting it. So there's a diagnostic function which is necessary, which we've gone through another podcast, but just to summarize my position, so we can address that. My starting point and it will be the end point is the need for spiritual evolution. And that was a driving force, and we both share that. There's a need for us all to spiritually evolve. And what that means is another issue. We can elaborate on that. But that on an individual level, and thus on a mass level at some stage, that the main evolution that we need is not a technological evolution or physical evolution, it's a spiritual evolution. That having been said, the greatest threat to our spiritual evolution is technology and the development of a tyranny, tech totalitarianism, a technocracy, a scientocracy, whatever way we want to describe it. We're talking about and I think it's happened already, that we're into the stage of totalitarianism. A lot of people don't understand that we've crossed the Rubicon in 2020, whereby the rudiments of a global governance system has been established, utilizing communications technology so that we can be effectively governed by machines on a global level, where the nation state is gone, where forces of resistance to are gone, and the military industrial complex is moving into a global phase where the citizen is not going to have any rights in relation to it, that will be enslaved, and that the evolution of the creation of dependency on technology means that we are effectively assimilated into the technology. It's becoming crystal clear to people that some of what people thought were conspiracy theories about single currencies are coming true. And all these things make us dependent, and they mean that there won't be options for people. They won't be able to escape. And ideas about going away to the countryside, off grid. There's no such thing as off grid in the system that's coming. The grid is entire and global. It's going to cover everything. every movement will be monitored. And as well as that, of course, we have the transhumanist, mass transhumanism through the network, which will mean that the system is coming into us. The system is coming into our body. So we'll be able to be monitored and controlled. So that's evidenced by a review of all the policy, the commitments of global organizations, their plans, the patents that have been granted, the policies that are there. But in particular, I have argued that there is one description of this system is an empire of scientism. It's based not on science, but on an ideological notion of scientism, which seeks to utilize science as an ideology beyond its methodological abilities, to claim more for science than it can deliver, to suggest that scientific principles can give meaning and truth beyond that which they're capable of doing. So it's a totalizing system. Its objective is to replace any competing systems, and as it replaces religion and states and the family, well, then there's no appeal to rights. There's no appeal to a counter narrative. There's no appeal to some of the values of art and culture. It's only what the scientific elite will decide. The empire of scientism, I use that term because it is imperial. It comes in particular from the British Empire, and that efflorescence of science associated with Darwin and Huxley, and in particular described by Wells in his books on the New World Order and the Open Conspiracy, describing a conspiracy of scientists to take over the world. And in the 1920s in Britain, it was promoted by people like Haldane, Birkenhead, J.D. Bernal, and this was associated with eugenics. It was developed through the exploration of DNA and through X-ray crystallography, when they could see into things, which was associated with an effort to control life, to understand what life is, and then to control it. So it really came out of that eugenics imperial movement, with the idea that there would be a master class, particularly scientists, who would rule over the rest and decide what they want to do. Now, that's what they have said. So there's no speculation on my part. I'm not extrapolating. This is what they said 100 years ago and before that, but in particular in the 1920s. You can throw into that some elements both from the right and the left. For example, if you look at Gramsci in Italy in the Prison Diaries, he's explaining that in order for communism to come to power, it has to destroy Catholicism, because he understood that he wasn't able to sell communism to people that believed in eternal life, and they couldn't do it. So that explains another methodology. You have to get rid of Christianity, and in particular Catholicism. So that's why some of these ingredients come into the equation we have to become aware of. And the right and left distinction doesn't make any difference. Both the communists and the neoliberals are going in the same direction. They're both going towards the Nietzschean Superman, Superwoman. It doesn't matter. It was the Bolsheviks and the Nazis were both very influenced by Nietzsche towards this super figure, towards science. So the fascists, communists, whoever, any idea which is based on the machine, on collectivism, on taking away the individual rights, has been informed by this kind of scientism. Now, the problem is, as C.S. Lewis in particular understood, and as in France, Jacques Ellul, Charbonneau, Gunther Anders realized that there's a life in technology itself, and that the next phase of totalitarianism would be this tech totalitarianism. Now, we know that that's the objective, because people like J.D. Bernal told us in the way, the world of flesh and the devil. So what we're witnessing now is the fruition of this policy for over a century, a specific policy, the idea of corporations taking over the world, a corporatist system, which was what Mussolini wanted to call fascism. It's a corporatist system beyond the control of nation states, beyond the control of international bodies, who capture international bodies and have no commitment to human rights, to humans. In fact, they have a very distinctive view of humans. They believe that humans are a kind of cancer on the planet that have to be reduced to a particular level. There's a very strong trend in this movement to believe that people are messy, they're not really nice, and they have to be eliminated. I mean, this is deep in the thing. And even when you look at some people, there are some ambiguous people in this, some of the heroes that may not be quite so heroic. For example, when Aldous Huxley was asked what's the most important problem of the future, he said it was overpopulation. And this is the argument. He also, a lot of people forget, was a member of the H.G. Wells Society, so he was close to that. So sometimes some of the people that are allegedly heroes are not necessarily so. George Orwell is seen to be a great hero for his prediction, but remember, he worked in the imperial police out in Burma, and when he was fighting, he was fighting for the communists in Spain. So often he's criticizing Stalinists, but he's not necessarily criticizing his own view of a materialist philosophy. So in both cases, and another example of this, how it all comes together, there's no left and right in this. If you look at the people that promoted the Iraq war, whether in Britain or America, or even some of the people that promoted some of the adventures of the Reagan administration in South America, they were formerly Trotskyites, and now they were neoliberals. George Galloway in Britain has said he remembered some of these people that were arguing for this kind of intervention, and he remembers them giving out leaflets, Marxist leaflets outside railway stations, and now they were supporting the American foreign policy, which was inconsistent with what the traditional left would have taught. So what people don't understand is that both sides are played by these organizations like BlackRock and whatever that can do anything. A lot of young people don't understand that they may be encouraged to promote goals that are not in their interest. They're not about the things they believe they are. So they can be manipulated. It's very, very difficult and it's taken me a long time, although I worked in the area and I've been studying the area for years to get a comprehensive and coherent analysis of the picture. And I've taught in business and international relations and law. So I do understand that from a disciplined and informed perspective, but it's quite difficult. So one of the things that we have to do is inform ourselves. But the key thing is that all these disparate things, even the war, we look at the war going on in Ukraine, etc., it was predictable, unfortunately. The American people often give in quickly towards a new argument presented to them. You know, the government is after withdrawn and leaving it's leaving your tax-paid stuff out in Afghanistan to support another war with more money from, you know, and don't mind about all the biolabs and all the messing about that's going, you know. So this is not about the American people at all. It's not wanted by the American people. It's promoting the Atlanticist goal, which is part of a general movement, a long held towards control, global governance, as Churchill said in 1943 about the empire of the mind. That the next empire would be the empire of the mind, to ensure order and to avoid chaos. This is what's happening. So, in summary, what we're seeing is the manifestation of a long-held policy of attainment of world government, of global governance, which is determined for the machine and by the machine, which intends to enslave the human, intends to displace the human, eradicate a lot of human, by left and by right, based on an ultra-materialist perspective that has no ethical basis, that will be defined by being a death culture, as we can see already in its promotion of euthanasia and all the things, euthanasia, war. These suit their purpose, because if your goal is to reduce people on the planet, as one of the goals, this serves the purpose. So there's a very dystopian goal if we don't wake up. That's the point. They've been doing it. So while most people have been out supporting their football teams and spending all their spare time recreation, supporting the sport and watching television programs. They've been working away on left and right to sew this up, so that there's no room to maneuver. The straitjacket is nearly on it. So that's the context, and there's a specific historical analysis, and that's really the explanation. There's no, this transhumanism, it's all the same thing. It all amounts to the same thing: global total control of the, that's the unpleasant aspect of, but that's the reality.
Right, absolutely. And just to hone in on a key few points that you already made within that, maybe to dive a little bit deeper, I think, as you just alluded to, the breads and circuses of it all really allows for our acquiescence to this, because it is a global governance system that's being created, but it's only being created with our own willingness to participate in it, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And whether the bread and circus is sports or it's today's politics, I think sometimes the left versus right serves as a good soap opera for people to really hone in on some tribal identification and give us deeper false sense of meaning in a lot of ways. But there's this, I think the acquiescence is possible. You mentioned it being an empire of mind, and I was alluded to long ago. I think there's this hyper self-identification with mind that allows the empire of mind to take place, because if we're only self-identifying as mind, and mind is that sensory experience of this life, this ego, this body. I am Evan, you are James. We are nothing more than beyond that. And we have this very limited self-identification on who we are. This potential transhumanist movement, which really promises almost a transcendence and extension of mind, it's going to be something that we are willingly acquiescing to. And so I think that's really, it's only our own participation that's allowing this to unfold. As much as, what you just described, it's easy to listen to and almost take on wanting to take on a victim mindset, or get into the, wow, this is happening to me. But we have to recognize that even though it is coming in at us from all angles within this system, and the system is imperializing on the mind, we have we can put up the barriers to create non-participation and to create resistance, which I'm sure we're going to get into. I mean, I was at the grocery store last week here in Montana, and this is a quote unquote free state. People like to call it that. It's a state where they're not having the agendas come in. At the grocery store, there is the pay with your palm option. So already we're, and I saw the only reason I noticed it, because I saw somebody put their palm down to pay that as a form of payment, and they walked away, and I didn't know what it was. I went and investigated. Sure enough, pay with your palm. So we're already seeing the human as technology, the human as the currency, the human as the data, if you will. We are the algorithm. We are the programming. And I think it's based on how it's been rolled out since the 1920s, and over the last 100 years, it's been a seamless transition. Because if we rolled it out all at once, certainly it's not going to fly. If they come up with this plan and try and implement it in 5 years, then it's probably not going to work. But I think it's important to realize we're much closer to the end of this plan than we are the beginning, and the origins of it are so far back. And if we look at the end, you talk about dates like Agenda 2030, it's called Agenda 2030 because the conclusion of it is meant to be 2030. We're so far closer to the end that, and I don't say that to put fear in people or make it seem like all hope is lost, but there's so much that's already taken place because of our own willingness to just kind of shrug our shoulders or go along, or think things are not a huge infringement, or it's not that inconvenient yet. But I think we do need to have a sense of responsibility for what is taking place and what's only going to continue to take place.
I've been thinking about C.S. Lewis recently, and he had his screw tape letters, where letters from a demon to his nephew. He's educating his nephew on about how you work as a demon. And he emphasizes that the most effective road to hell is the gentle one. And we've been on that. If we go back 100 years and look at the First World War, there's a lot of celebration of the First World War, annual celebrations by people that never go to war or that use it for political purposes or use it for national identity that they don't even believe in. The politicians don't believe in national identity. So if you look at the absurdity of the millions of people killed in the trenches, for example, and I mean, for the Irish people went over there to fight. There was Irish people fighting for Irish independence, and they were saying, well, what's this about you're going over to fight for the freedom of small nations? It was an absurdity. It was nothing got to do with the freedom of small nations, as we know. They don't care about the nations. And one of the great sadnesses of that is how it continued, how they understood that they weren't moving, that they were going to get slaughtered by the machinery, and it just kept on for years, and there was no effective movement to stop it. And the absurdity of it, apart from all the horror of it, it's just how and great minds would get involved in something so absurd without saying, you know what I mean? Okay, this is, but I mean, I'm not saying that was an easy option, but so we can do absurd things. And since then, we have been bought very, very cheaply with entertainment and with the music industry, food, again, an appeal to the senses. In relation to the point, one point, as you were saying, that I think that there's a certainly, when we're talking about the 5 sense reality, we have to be careful not to reduce it to reduce our consciousness to that. But at the same time, and this is have a slight different emphasis from, say, David Icke on that, what we shouldn't do is underestimate the significance of incarnation, because the danger is that contributes, not saying him, but that argument can contribute towards their argument. Oh, well, it's not so important, and that. So it's very, very important that we look after and appreciate our body and our consciousness, and not give it away cheaply as well,
right? And
accepting it, or much more than that, because a lot of the transhumanists promote a similar argument. So it's very, very important that we protect our body, protect our nature, protect our relationship with nature, because it's true that the attack on that physicality first, that they can get into the mind and get into the soul and get into the higher dimensions. So we have to, although if we look at it in a biblical sense, in Ephesians, you know, we fight, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities, and that's very important, and I believe in that. But actually, our fight will be in this domain, in this physical domain, with other people in the form in which we find them, and once we recognize their spiritual consciousness as they do, as we react. But there is a price to pay. There is in a lot of spiritual traditions, there is a kind of hellish place that one goes to as one not as spiritually evolved. Now, you don't have to interpret it as a punishment. You can interpret it as a state that reflects one's own internal state. So it's not as if necessarily we don't have to explain it in terms of an angry God saying, Evan, you did bad, you're going down this place. But we can see it as a continuation of a state of confusion associated with our failure to take responsibility. Now, state is a good word because it's a way to see the entirety. That what you have management over is, the only thing you have management over is the state of your own consciousness. That's what you have at the moment, and that's what I try and control. Then we live in a state, and that's also being destroyed as well. They're breaking down states so that that's what the idea of this open border movement is, to take that state away. And that's to move towards a state of the world. That's their objective. So the state of the world, the global governance system, and they call it the state of the world, will then control, on a macro level, will control the state of your mind, because it will be an automatic system. So state is very, very important, and changing state. So we're going through a process of altering states at all the levels, and the barriers between this mass system and us directly are being taken away. And the more we create this connection through global currencies, etc., the less opportunity we have to be able to resist it, because our ability to move, our ability to do anything else will be compromised. These notions of freedom that people retain, their aspirations, they don't work if you live in a prison. You can have all the free, you can have it on one level, but you can't have actual freedom, because you can be controlled. So state is an important concept to consider. And the state of the world also refers to what an automatic machine sees when it's, when it's dealing with the world. So the plantation of automatons I've described will be this worldwide plantation. I think it's virtually here now, where we will be automatized, where we will go through a devolution in our physical form. Now, if we do that, and according to all the traditions, you're not going up to the higher regions of the spiritual world, because you have given away your, whatever you want to call it, divine given consciousness, your reflection of the divine in you, your free will. You have given that away, in that slow descent into mediocrity. And this is what most of the commercial system is about. It's not about genuine economics. It's not about genuine production. It's about creating a control system. So yeah, we have a big responsibility, and it's not really fair to say to people, "Oh, it's not your fault. It's all these bad people." No, it is the masses' fault. And if they don't wake up, in my view, they'll pay a price for it. Every individual will pay a price. You're going to pay a price anyway if you don't pay attention to your spiritual consciousness. This is just reminding you a bit more that there will be a price to pay for yourself, for your children, whatever, for the future of humanity. So that dark contrast is actually all the more reason why we should engage in the good struggle towards the light, if you like.
Right, absolutely. It fulfills us with a deeper sense of meaning and purpose and ability to, responsibility is what creates a sense of fulfillment within the individual and nourishes the spirit in a lot of ways.
And meaning, as you said, which you've talked about before. That's right. Exactly.
Absolutely. And, James, I was watching this documentary on Gaia TV, and when I went into it, I didn't necessarily know what perspective it was going to take. It was called Artificial Immortality, and I just saw the title. I saw the robot as the image that was describing it. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Let me see what this perspective is about. And it was actually very much a pro-transhumanist documentary. I found it interesting to really sit and engage with what their arguments were, because as I hear you talking about, the hive mind that's going to be created, right? And a lot of the spiritual inversion that's naturally taking place in order to get people to buy into a lot of this. There's really, as you already alluded to, this empire of science. It's like the science itself has taken on the role of religion, in the sense that they're using science as a method of transcendence. And, they even say directly in the documentary, their science is conquering death, right? And it's that, imperialist mindset that you already alluded to, this and how the imperialism is going inward. Right. And also, and within the documentary, it was kind of hard to sit through, because, I'm sitting there taking notes, vehemently disagreeing with most of the stuff that they're saying. But I can see why that they're ultimately buying into it, because there is this um, expression of transcendence that I feel transhumanism is attempting to articulate. I think it is with this, as you mentioned, which I think is a very important point. It's important to not disregard the body and disregard the human experience. And really, we should embrace this sensory experience. And even if we know that that we aren't just this, in the same sense, in the present moment, we also are just this, right? There's the beautiful paradox of it where we can really embrace who we are in this moment and embrace the physicality. But that expression of transcendence that humanism talks about, where they talk about the soul being data, right? That was another direct quote. They talk about what they call they really essentially took the notion of consciousness and mind, and what they said is they reverted it to what they called a mind file, which is like this set of data points, set of algorithms that make up the soul. And they view the soul as something that can be captured and transmitted beyond body, right? And they view it as something that can be extended. But for me, when I look at that, and they call it a mind file to refer to the soul, it kind of comes back to that idea of the rigid self-identification with mind and with ego, but not so much with body, right? I mean, if we it might have been you who I was talking with about this in the past. If we had a reverence for the body, why do we have such a fear of death? And when somebody dies, we shuttle away the body. We don't want to look at the body. We can't sit with the body. And in other cultures, they actually celebrate and they hold a reverence and a beauty for death in particular, right? So I feel like people are really gravitating towards the tech, and when we look at something like the environmentalist movement, again, they're viewing technology as the savior, as opposed to recognizing we are nature, and technology is what's imperializing upon nature. We're creating the problems with our imperialistic technocratic worldview. I mean, I saw an article about cutting down trees for the purpose of climate change just a week ago, and it wasn't actually like a parody. It was legitimate. There was a city council had devised some plan. They were cutting down trees for the purpose of climate change, and it's just one of those natural inversions that are taking place inward, where we're so disconnected from the roots of who we are. But at the same time, there's this I would say allure to immortality, this allure to the extension of mind, and we're willing to really disregard body. We're really willing to disregard the human experience, and ultimately the true nature of the soul and the true nature of the spiritual consciousness. I think we know we're more than body. So technology is sort of hijacking that deeper, in a lot of ways, unconscious knowing, and able to I would say operate on the unconscious and subconscious level, and I'd say create an acceptance, create an acquiescence, kind of what we were talking about. And so I think a lot of people are well intended, especially with these ideas, but they don't recognize maybe the system that they're playing into at large, and what the actual consequences of an acquiescence to this is. And Father, forgive, for they do not know any better. There's a certain level of empathy we need to have for that, but in the same sense, a lot of these consequences, forgiveness is not going to make it better, or it's not going to be what gets us out of, or liberates us, I would say.
Yeah, well, you raised a lot of issues in my mind there. So, not talking about the producers of that particular film, but really the same people that are selling this idea are the same people that would probably support the end of life for old people. You know that on the Liverpool pathway in Britain, that if you get to a certain age, you go into the hospital, they won't give you any food or water, you die basically. It's euthanasia. So they let the people die in horrific circumstance as it is. This is a government policy. You know that euthanasia is spreading in Belgium and Canada. The government is recommending it to people who, even if they say they have a little mental problem or even a medical problem, they're recognized. This is a death cult that was coming. So we're asked to believe that these people that prize human life so much and want to give it immortality are going to do so in circumstances where they don't want to give life to people that are on the planet and they want to take it away. And the military industrial complex that's behind this supposed gift of physical immortality is so busy taking away human life and is willing to run risks and willing to destroy people. It's a dirty big lie, this idea about immortality. It's a sales mechanism. There's no desire to give immortality to anybody. This is the claim. They said in the 20s that they would turn people into silicon. But my main reading of that is that what you have is something like the Matrix. It's really a hell. Basically, they've materialized a hell, and it looks demonic in many senses. I don't have a problem in saying that anymore. And C.S. Lewis, in his book That Hideous Trend in 1945, has an organization called NICE, which there was the Organization of National Institute of Clinical Experiments. It was set up in 1999 in Britain. They used the same name as this nefarious organization. It's unbelievable. And they went in COVID. They had SAGE, which refers back to perennial. It's a kind of psychopathic joke in relation to what's going on. But he has this scientific organization which is taken over governance in the United Kingdom, doing experiments, communicating with aliens, demons, etc., and engaging in kind of transhumanism. So he's telling us about that in 1945, and he was very well connected. He saw what it was going. So it's a prison. It's a big lie. They're cutting down the trees, most likely because they're expanding the grid network and trees get in the way. So not only do they have all this 5G, but we have 6G and 7G and other things to come. And also the probability that your street lights are going to be used as potential control mechanisms. If you have we have a bit of disturbance there in Montana and you have our street lights going on, they'll be able to operate on the human nervous system. It's a control mechanism because they want to be able to translate all the money they have taken from individuals, from countries. All the money has gone up to this small group of people at the top, encouraged by the left and the right. They've accumulated more wealth, and they can use that surplus to extend the control system. And this is what George Carlin said, that they're coming back for your pension money because they want everything. There's a strange thing, but they want the whole lot of it. They don't want you to have a little bit. And they have to destroy the middle class anyway, because it's always the middle class that's behind revolutions. They have to destroy people of European origin, because a lot of the revolutions came in Europe, and these are the type of people that might rebel against them. So they have to destroy them populations as well. They have to destroy any homogeneity and replace it with heterogeneity, so they can have a divide and conquer strategy. So there is no group. They won't be able to have a Tower of Babel, so people won't be able to even talk effectively to their neighbors that have different worldviews, different experiences, different historical experiences, and they won't be able to form an effective response to this system. So the lie of immortality. If you look back at Malachi Martin, who was very well informed about these things, exorcist and worked at the Vatican, Jesuit, and who had studied ancient texts. He said really that the transhumanist thing would be driven by use of other humans, so through constant transplantation. Yesterday, I think it was, there was a successful prosecution for conspiracy to traffic a person for organ harvesting under the relevant legislation. They say there's no conspiracies. Well, this was a conspiracy successfully proved. of bringing a person over from Africa so they could take their organs. Now this is a huge industry, and that's probably one of the soundest ways that they will use to prolong their life, as well as all the other ghoulish ones we won't get into. So the immortality promise is really, where it exists, would only be a promise of hell for most people. The idea that we could get your consciousness, if possible. It would probably not be done by this transfer. It would probably be done by some mechanism whereby they try and maintain your consciousness, maintain part of your body and relate it to a system, because there are systems, there are organizations that now do harvest the body for electrical energy and things like that. You can sell your energy. So that's there. And in the patents, in particular, the one from Microsoft, 2020 06 06 06, that one, it shows that they intend to use the human body as part of the system as they assimilate it. So the reality is, as really it was clear, Bernal said that the scientific elite would allow transfer of people to silicon, but they would have to be controlled because they're mechanical beings. Then they would be born in that ectogenesis genetic way. So it's a massive left brain control system. And you say, well, I don't want to change. Well, then you live in the human zoo, and they're constructing the human zoo already. And the only difference is, in the human zoo, the animals get different cages. You have the lions over here and the monkeys over here, and they get fed. It's not going to be like that. There'll be a zoo without walls in the 15-minute cities. And because when the people are fighting against each other, they're not going to be rebelling against their masters. So there's no real nice interpretation of the vision they have for us. And this, the shiny version of the immortality, well, they don't understand what consciousness is. So how they can claim to replicate, they don't even know what consciousness is. So how they can claim to replicate it is absurd. And most good mathematicians and good scientists understand that consciousness is not merely the thing they can measure.
Right, absolutely. And within the documentary, they had Deepak Chopra in it, who is the well-known figure in certain holistic and new age circles, and he was embracing this type of technology as a way to almost, how they articulated it was a way to pass down wisdom to generations through the ancestors. His great grandchildren can go and connect with AI Deepak, and all of a sudden know Deepak Chopra, right? And then be able to have this extended connection in life. And it's a very inverted way of, because within that you recognize that the human who is embodying Deepak Chopra in that sense is still going to die at some point, right? He's not going to be the AI that is Deepak Chopra. It is essentially almost like a clone, only a technological clone that is existing in this computer cloud. But if the computer in the cloud is the only form of reality that we begin to understand, and I think many scientists have predicted that eventually artificial intelligence and the cloud and the metaverse are going to become indistinguishable from actual reality that we're in right now. That's going to create this mass confusion, almost like a psychosis of technology, where we're inescapable from it, right? And I think as you alluded to, the human zoo, this domestication of man has been needed to actually allow that foundation to be take place, so that we can we've really forgotten how, if it's like a tiger, if it's lived in the zoo and raised in a zoo its whole life, you throw it out in nature, there's a good chance it's not going to survive, right? That's just how it works, because it's lost its natural instincts and ability to connect with the land and understand how to naturally survive and take care of itself. So there really is no conscious understanding that anything outside of that zoo and that programming even exists. It's like in
mm,
Brave New World, where they're born into the ectogenesis
mm,
scenario, where they're given the
mm,
the programming, subliminal programming from very,
mm,
very early ages, which is programming the thoughts, programming the behaviors, creating a social caste system in a
mm,
lot of ways based on their
mm,
identification and their role and their given purpose by the state. Uh, if that is programmed into you from the moment that you are born, it's really, and I think this is why they target the younger generations with this technology, is because if it's all they know, then
mm,
they're not gonna understand what life was like 100 years ago, or they're not gonna understand how it was when you were raised, or even when I was raised.
mm,
And I had a little bit of time in my childhood where there wasn't the technology around, and I learned from going outside and playing and scraping my knees in the dirt and things of that nature, right? And there's a beauty to that. Um, but in the generation now where the iPad is the babysitter, or the only form of play is through these apps and through technology, and the form of social connection is through social media, we're just naturally, the stories of who we are, they're going to naturally change because the programming it's different for the youngest generation. And so I
mm.
think that's why they target the young, and why the young are so um, captivated in this technology, and in most acquiescing to a lot of the societal agendas and narratives. It's because the system is raising them to be so. And with there's so many different elements you could touch on within that, and the different types of programming and indoctrination taking place.
Yeah. There's
But
a
yeah,
before we begin to move on to the positive things, just let me just
yeah,
let me clarify. The zoo is not the worst option. Uh,
okay,
the 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 next level of it is to turn you into plant, and this is by linking you into the system, and then this is all plant. Electronic equipment is plant. Telecommunication system is plant. So you become integrated when this stuff, when whatever graphene goes in your body, it's biocompatible, and they can interact with the system. It's good semiconductor, etc. So then you begin to become plant. So this is the reversal of evolution. You're going from spiritual being, human. The next level is meant to be angels, or moving up to the next, but we're going reverse. So we're going human to animal, the animal stage, where we're nearly finished that. We don't realize we've been treated like animals, but that's really the way they saw us, and they're quite open about that now. But the next level is plants, where literally we become plants, and that's the next stage on the devolution according to all the system. And what's after plant is minerals, and that's the next stage. And you might think, so we're down from the zoo. So you have the bodies, or you have the things in your body. The human body, according to some theories, is very much liquid crystal. A lot of the way it works is liquid crystal. This stuff that's gone into your body is crystal. We are becoming crystallized. The system is crystallizing. We become part of that. Once we become crystallized, where they can manage us, well, then we lose the capacity for individual judgment, and we effectively become. We could go further and become petrified, literally, as in the idea of turning into stone. But that's a realistic possibility. Now, remember that Elon Musk said, with the technology, DNA technology, they can turn the human into a butterfly. And he's describing what happens when they can control your DNA, which they can. So all these possibilities are there. It's not, and then they can do the experiments as they said they would do 100 years ago. So they can, that little teddy bear that's behind you, they can get they can make things like that in reality. They can begin to construct strange beings and mix them up with each other and have fun for this great entertainment vision. But this is the kind of nonsense that people will do when that happens. Now, when you mentioned Deepak Chopra, you reminded me of a kind of a thing that's been on my mind recently. It's about which is important as we move into the light stage, is about kind of false prophets. Now, I haven't studied enough of him, but I'm very suspicious about. It's not something that speaks to me. And when I look at some of these figures, they're engaged in scientism as well. It's kind of a pseudoscience stuff. And remember that Kurzweil wrote about spiritual machines. Now, his view of what the spirit is and my view would be completely different. But they're trying to capture that ground by redefining what the spirit is. So if you look at a lot of these people, they didn't really have a lot to say about the abuse of human rights recently. I didn't hear them talking, and in fact, a lot of them supported it. You mentioned about Sadhguru as in one of your talks, and again, he's another man that wants, in his great spiritual enlightenment, wants to reduce the population of the world. I've heard that before. So some of the people that are being presented as great spiritual leaders are not necessarily the ones that we want. And a figure that there's some figures in the middle that people find very difficult to understand. Are they good guys or bad guys in this? And one of them is Teilhard de Chardin. And now, for me, he's on the wrong side. He's effectively a transhumanist. And people are reading things when he says about Christ consciousness and all this, they're reading something else into it. And the people that criticize technology, like Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau, they identified de Chardin as on the wrong side. They called him a prophet of totalitarianism. But it's difficult when you read him, people see something else that he's not saying, and they're not looking at the whole context. And Ellul and Charbonneau are very important people. They're important people in the description of the technological society. And I was communicating with a Christian Roy who went out and met them years ago in France. And so I'm trying to assess in relation to position of my ideas, do they accord with what is written? A lot of stuff is still in French. And then you have interesting figures like Jordan Peterson. Now, again, give him credit for the things when he speaks to people and he's presenting certain things. It's difficult to know where he stands on certain things. That having been said, for a man that said that he wouldn't allow certain words be put in his mouth, he was very open to, getting an injection in his body. I'm not complaining about it. He didn't seem to notice the abuse of human rights until it was kind of over. Mm-hmm. And I heard him talking with someone on Canadian fundamental rights, and it was as if the fundamental rights aspect of the charter was kind of new to him. And I was saying, well, that's worrying. Now, again, giving him credit for the things that he's saying. When asked about, it's interesting, when asked about God, for example, he says, do you believe in God? Well, well, what do you mean by do? What do you mean by you? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean, etc. And kind of weasel words in relation to the thing. So there's all these. There's going to be an effort to present soft versions of the hard cop guy that appeals to certain constituencies. He's all the time, when you're looking at critiques of this technocratic society, he always regards as a mistake. It was a mistake. Oh, they used opinion polls. They shouldn't have done that, etc. And he's very willing to forgive these massive institutions at a global level, but very critical of individuals in relation to on an individual level. His advice was certainly prophetic. Tidy your room, because you weren't going to be doing much else when you were locked in your room. So I mean, some of these figures appeal to a lot of people, certainly have something to say, but whether it is actually critical now, and he's organizing a big conference, an international conference about the way forward, and my view of him has always been that he's going to present a simulacrum of religion. That's what that was always me. From the first time I saw him, I just had a feeling that he's presenting a substitute for religion that will work in a secular world, which would recognize that there's been changes. So you get all these figures that time will tell in relation to them, but we don't have the luxury in relation to. We have to begin to inform ourselves so that we have in our own personal reference a way to be able to interpret these figures and to interpret, not because everyone's waiting for a hero. Oh, here's a guy that's going to save us. Here, you can have all my whatever, attention, money, whatever. You save me. And physician, heal thyself. The poor man had some difficulties himself, but he said worrying things that would worry me. For example, he said in an interview recently, that he goes around all the time with a group of security ex-military that bring him around. He said, okay, well, that's a bit concerning. Being transported around. Poor man had a nervous breakdown, then being transported around. So we have to really look at. We have to also now not coming to a final conclusion about him. Other people would come to a final conclusion about, but we have to be careful as well that we're not jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. Mm-hmm. And the only way to do that is to develop ourselves, left brain and right brain, to develop our own analysis based on evidence, to kind of test it, to be robust on it, and to develop it oneself, and also to resist nonsense ones, because there's a lot of anti-Semitic stuff, it's the Jew, all that nonsense, and they're being used deliberately to divide people and to create distractions and all that. So there has to be a sound historical analysis and not some nonsense stuff. So they should look at a proper analysis, and then also look at a firm base for spiritual evolution. There has to be something with some substance to it, and not some vague simulacrum, or we'll go back to square one.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's important to have that end picture for the agenda in mind, and recognize what is the direction we're moving in. And when we're listening to anybody, whether it's somebody in the mainstream corporate media, and if it's a figure like a Joe Biden, or if it's somebody in the quote unquote alternative media, to listen to their actual words and not be attached to certain opinions about who they might be or what somebody says. I tend to think of, there's this quote I saw attributed to somebody named Albert Pike, who is heavily involved with Freemasonry. If the people need a hero, we shall provide them with one. Right. So we have to be very weary, especially of alternative viewpoints, quote unquote alternative viewpoints, that are heavily promoted, such as all of the mainstream picking up this idea of the lab leak theory, and talking about Trump and DeSantis and U.S. politics coming in as an alternative to the woke madness. And Elon Musk is the perfect example of somebody who is promoted as this. The mainstream media hates him because he's a quote unquote figure of free speech and for the people. And but at the same time, he's developing the Neuralink technology. He's developing, working with DARPA in terms of shooting up satellites to create the smart grid, autonomous vehicles, right? So he's deeply involved in all of the technological engineering and development of transhumanism.
Remember what Bernal said was that the key would, the master class, the elite group, would be engaged in space exploration and increase human intelligence and merge with machine. They were the kind of key elements. So if that's what the people are in, well, no matter what they say, if these are the goals that they're promoting, they're on that side. You know that. So they might come around and say, oh, I love bunnies and I love teddy bears and all that kind of stuff. But if that's really what they're for, this is the agenda of your enslavement. and especially if they're a billionaire or whatever. So,
Right.
yeah.
And they're heavily promoted. And, I think I attribute my own early spiritual development, right, to somebody like Russell Brand, for example, who I was watching his self-development videos on YouTube in like 2018, 2019, and I gained some inspiration from his own spiritual journey. But I recognize he's also, you described that. And again, I'm not making a final conclusion about it.
No.
I'm never the type of person to, sometimes
Yeah.
you go under comment sections and you just say, oh, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater and yell controlled opposition. And I
Yes,
think we need to
exactly.
be
Yeah.
very careful about doing that, because
Correct.
even within these alternative viewpoints, even if they're quote unquote controlled opposition, you can find elements of truth and you can further understand perspectives, even if it's further understanding what the agenda is, right? So I think we need to continue to listen to all perspectives. But, when we dive into somebody like, I guess, a Russell Brand or Jordan Peterson, all of these people, and I've listened to both of them quite frequently in the past, I think is being mindful about that. Is this information being presented to what you described actually at the very beginning of the podcast, where is it almost sort of reactionary, or we're talking about the Great Reset and we're talking about Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the banking collapse and all of these different these current events that are happening? Are we being hyper fixated on the current events within the alternative media instead of really developing a game plan and focusing on the spiritual development? I mean, I remember there was a conversation I tuned into recently between Russell Brand and Eckhart Tolle, for example. And Eckhart Tolle, somebody who's a very focused on the spiritual path. And, they talked about something I thought was interesting within their conversation was this idea of finding the balance between being relaying that information versus coming back to the spiritual growth and path and just the continual expression and of oneself, and not being afraid to express those types of opinions and talking about because here we are for the first hour, maybe somebody listened in and they're like, oh my gosh, the world is going down the tubes, right? But in a deeper sense, we're still here to converse about these about the path forward and the solutions, and how we do have to acknowledge some of the shadows in the murkier water to actually develop a well thought out and articulated plan to how to combat what is taking place. Because if we don't understand what's going on, then we're not going to be able to actually dig it at the root. I mean, I think the greatest way to come up with a solution is to simply acknowledge the root of the issue and take it out from the root, right? That's really how you develop. I mean, if you're going to take a weed out of your garden, for example, and to make a plant analogy, I suppose, you're going to take a weed out of the garden, you have to get it out by the root, otherwise it's going to come right back. I mean, there's no other way around that. So I think it's an interesting integration and balancing process that needs to take place. And, learning how to do that is certainly, I think, part of the development, the individual development path, and really part of, I think, some of the spiritual development that's necessary in order to counter a lot of what's taking place.
And just the last point on that, again, it's all well and good telling people about how to relax and ignore the things outside, but sometimes you can't ignore the things outside.
Right.
And sometimes you have to say, and sometimes you say, hold on, that's wrong. It's clearly wrong. It's illegitimate. There has to be some base. There has to be some, people use the word natural law. That's fair enough. Some right and wrong. And this is an important thing that we'll have to talk about as well. And again, we'll know about, I mean, if you take Russell Brand and that, he's certainly saying all the right things in the last year or two. He's definitely saying all the right things. But if you go back earlier on, as David Icke says, well, you know, when he was making his points, he says that, well, he only goes so far, you know, and he's not sure what he's about. And of course, he does think that Yuval Noah Harari is great, and you say, well, okay, right. and he has a podcast called Under the Skin, and that's what Yuval Noah Harari says. So I'd like a bit of clarification on that. But the point is, so give him the benefit of the doubt. But what happened if I think back when there was 17% unemployment in Dublin, and you had a Dublin band, U2. Bono was just not far from where I was born. So they come along, you know, all these jackets, and they're angry, and they're talking about heroin, and they're talking about. But why do they come along? They come along because the providers of the propaganda network needs to draw off the anger of the people. So there's a problem. I mean, there's a problem for the public. You go along, you hear all this. Oh, people hear us. You know, they have to listen to us now, but they don't. All they're doing is harvesting your energy to dissipate it, and that's what a lot of the music industry is about. I'm skeptical about the totality of the pop music industry. I really, if you look at it, it's we can talk about another time, but I'm extremely skeptical about its role in this. It's part of the process. So there's a lot of people, again, not saying this about Ike, but we have to bear in mind that certain individuals are put in there to directly reflect what we think, in order that we feel like it's being addressed, you know, because if it's articulate, then it takes away that energy. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that those people are conscious they're doing that, but that's really what they get a platform for, as opposed to people that get a platform and say, actually, we have to focus on this. So time will tell on that. But ultimately, it doesn't take away our own responsibility for spiritual evolution and how we might contribute and how we might develop ourselves, because we still have to develop ourselves spiritually.
Right.
But yeah,
I
agree. We have to begin to look forward and think about how we might analyze the situation going forward from.
Right. And what would you say what are, in your eyes, what are foundational ways to do that? Because when I look at what's taking place in the world, and, you know, I think we're going to have to, even as we talk about spiritual evolution and how to develop oneself, we have to recognize where are the illusions of spiritual development that are being presented to us. Because, you know, as we've already talked about in this podcast a little bit, and certainly in other podcasts that we've done, is that movements like transhumanism, they're rooted in an inversion of spiritual principles, right? A lot of these ideas, you know, when we talk about the de-evolution of man and moving into essentially like a plant, and as we're harvested into this hive mind, you could argue that's the ultimate inversion of the recognition of our own oneness, right? I mean, we're giving up our individuality to move into a plant, into the hive mind, into the automated system, when the reality is, it's like the idea of communism being used as a way to, they say it's unity, when the reality they find the empathetic nature within people and the deeper knowing of our own oneness to promote a false sense of unity, when it's really just control. It's the same type of idea where we're buying into this hive mind, or this, you know, the new age ideal of let's move into the artificial immortality, to this transcendence that's being promoted. So a lot of people, I think, view the technology as the next frontier for spiritual evolution, right? There's a very much, I think, a reductionist view of what spirituality is and what the soul is, and that creates a really need for individual discernment in regarding the spiritual path, and what is illusionary versus what is true spirituality, right? So, I mean, what are your thoughts on navigating that and actually going on that?
Let's try and think about the big picture going forward, and how we might think of it in broad brush strokes. Sometimes when I was teaching a class at the start of the year, at the start of the course, you'd give a kind of overview to try and show how disparate things. But I'll make a stab at how I think we have to look at it in relation to, if we're thinking. I said, talking in terms of a master plan. I know people don't like master plans now, but call it master plan, or something as a mass active spiritual resistance to tyranny, or some acronym in that sense. Because anything we do has to be first for ourselves, and then on a mass level, because it's a mass issue now. So it has to be responded to on that level. But it has to be based on first on ourselves. So we have to do it anyway. We have to, whether they take you away tomorrow and throw you in prison for 20 years for all the podcasts you've done or whatever, you still have to evolve spiritually. It's not going to stop. Under whatever conditions, we still want to do that. Now, people don't want it. That's fine. Have your popcorn and go and watch the basketball games all the time, and let's see what happens. And in the afterworld, it's up to yourself. Let the people find it. That's their choice. But I mean, I'm talking about people that have some awareness of spiritual consciousness, or believe that they're spiritual beings. And maybe this is a separation, as Steiner and that predicted, and other people predicted, that there is this split, and that this is the next stage of evolution, that some people will continue to evolve spiritually, and other people won't. They'll become merged with the machine, and you're not going to evolve spiritually. There's very few true spiritual thinkers, I think, believe that. Although some do, and even within Christianity, within Mormonism, there are people that believe transhumanism is the way forward. But the first thing is, you do have to get at the word you like, meaning. You have to say, well, what is the meaning of life? And associate with that, what is the objective? And if we go back to Plato, Aristotle, you had eudaimonia, the idea of a sense of happiness, which was a deep sense of, well, you have it in the US Constitution, but it's a deeper sense of satisfaction with meaning, with accommodation of your existence in the world. So there's some kind of objective on a personal level and at a global level, and that was associated with being in good spirits or something like that. That was the idea. So it's the idea of a state, the state of your spirit in a good state with a progression. Now, for me, spiritual evolution is a continuation, because I believe we survive after death. So the state that we're in now will move into the next stage as well, and that's consistent with a number of traditions. Now, we're addressing a particular problem. We're addressing a big machine that wants to take away our spirituality. So in that context, what we have to do first and foremost is begin to have a ceasefire in relation to other people, trying to convince people of other persuasions in the spiritual domain that our way is the best way. We have to accept where we are, move in a particular tradition as we will, but recognize that we're all under threat, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Buddhist, or just a New Ager. All spiritual consciousness is under threat. So one of the first principles is to stop picking holes in other people's religion at this stage. This is not the time for that. Sometime in the future, you can address them, but really their objective as well is to split us up. They did it very successfully in Ireland. They created that Catholic Protestant thing. It was constructed. I could go through the history of that, but it was constructed. My great fear is that they will try and create some kind of global civil war based on race and based on religion. The obvious one would be to create a Muslim-Christian war that would serve their purposes of reducing the population and being able to claim that religion was the basis of all war. So it's a grave danger that we face from any military complex that wants to establish a global order that will crave it to intervene and stop it on the grounds of reason. Which is why we have to be careful not to be polarizing people on the basis of their religion. What religious people have to do is have dialogue about a common interest. and to avoid this basis. But if we say that kind of happiness or whatever in the broadest sense, and well, consistent with the different paths that people have towards it, we don't say you give up your religious or a traditional background. And in fact, I support the traditional approach as a perennialist, meaning that there's a range of different paths to get to where you want to go to. There's a range of different ways to get to there. So we have to respect them. And so, for example, I'll take the example of critiques that I hear common. If you look at Christianity, a lot of the critiques are designed to vilify it so that it can destroy opposition to the materialist agenda. So a lot of the histories are not, a lot of recent histories that are being promoted to younger people are kind of poor scholarship. They're picking holes that historically and good scholarship kind of don't accept. They present fanciful information. So one has to be very critical and look at proper scholarship. There was an interesting debate recently, or Joe Rogan had a guest on who was talking about Christianity. And it was a thing that I've said before as well, that when you're talking about conspiracy theories, that if the principle is, or the argument is, that Jesus Christ never existed as a historical figure, well, then you would have to posit the greatest conspiracy in history, in ever, for that proposition to be justified. Because all of the people that conspired for 2,000 years to make that the case would have been involved in a conspiracy. And when you look at the scholarship and look at the evidence and read some of the good books, it's the evidence for the historical figure is very strong. I mean, so what I'm saying is that we have to be careful to understand that there are people that want to undermine traditional viewpoints, because traditional viewpoints oppose some of these agendas, and they have to get rid of them, as Gramsci said. Mm-hmm. And so my position is that we should be respectful for all spiritual traditions, and also that they should begin to look at the common interest and the fact that the common interest is in opposing this force of scientism. Now, for example, Islam is on the rise, for example, in Europe. It's clearly on the rise. It's going to displace Christianity in a number of countries very, very quickly. And if you're a Muslim, you'd be very happy with that. And you'd be very happy with the apparent movement towards a caliphate or whatever. It's a natural consequence of a global religion. But as Christianity is destroyed, it's not on the agenda to leave Islam. So if you look back at what H.G. Wells said, that they needed to destroy the family, the nation state, and religion. So it's only a strategic interplay. So we have to begin to think in terms of, if this is what they said they were going to do, this is their strategy. What are the tactics they use? And also, people will have to be tactical about what they do. So in that response to this, I'm advocating non-violence. That's a first principle. But it has to be on a mass scale. Any reaction is going to have to be on a mass scale. Now, it can't be through any organ. And I can state this after studying Irish history, and when the people were fighting against empires and kings and queens and systems, and the British Empire were one of the most successful of all these systems. That any organization that you set up will be captured. If it's dangerous to that complex, it will be taken over. It's as simple as that. So even if it's secret. So any mass organization shouldn't be organized. So it should be of the nature of a mass organization, which has no formal bonds. It's merely a mass of people who are capable of aligning around some core principles, whether it be opposition to transhumanism or opposition to mass medication or whatever. So there it can't be captured. In many ways, it would be like an invisible, non-violent army. It was invisible because you can't go and capture them and put them in prison. It's non-violent, and it's a spiritual army in many senses. So even INVA or something like that. Yeah, but that would be the way it would work. In relation to how it would align itself, I've talked before about a mystic murmuration. At certain times, you get a congregation of people, or based on the analogy, we have historically a congregation of light, but I've used the idea of a murmuration of a flock of birds that moves together. They often do it for communal reasons, for whatever they want to do, that get together, but also they may be doing it to disturb a predator, because it's difficult for the predator to attack a mass. It confuses them, they get disorientated. So there's other reasons why they use it. And according to scientists, the one bird influences 7 birds around it with their little wing, and that's how they move in unison. So some kind of model like that, I think, would work on a bigger scale, where we get people that are influencing a range of people around them, and that core ideas will disseminate through that group. And to take one of the greatest technologies that can be used against humans in the brain-computer interface is graphene. And graphene derives its strength and versatility from the fact that it's only 1 atom thick. So it's like a honeycomb shape in a hexagon, but the you only need a limited number of links for a thing to work. So, by the same token, in an interactive, communicative group of people, the core focus on core ideas predicated on recognition of the spirit could be marshaled to focus on the problem, and it would be so diverse that it would be impossible to shut down, basically, around some key principles that are robust and that are well backed up by history, that anticipates some of the directions. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Abolition of Man in 1943, where he anticipates, through his awareness of what was happening, he anticipates the scientocracy and the potential disappearance of man. And he said that the big problem is a problem of sorcery, basically, that magic and science are very closely related, and that traditionally what people did was they adhered to the Tao, or the way. So he doesn't take Christianity as he takes the Tao. So in every culture up to now, humankind sought to adjust to what was there, to the Tao or the way. And the Tao for him represents the perennial tradition, the same in Buddhism, same in Christianity, the same in Islam, same for Sufis, the same in Hinduism, that they recognize the forces and the divine forces as well, and they accommodate themselves to that. And in all traditions, there's some basic principles about not taking life, about respecting life, about not telling lies. It's not really difficult. The people go on about dogma, but it's not really difficult. Don't be killing people. That's not too hard to remember. Don't be shooting people. Don't be bombing them. Don't be stabbing them. Whatever other way you want to do it. Don't be starving old people. Don't be beating people with clubs. Don't be injecting them with things that will kill them. It's not really difficult. It's in all the traditions. Don't be telling lies. Tell the truth. It's not difficult to understand. Do your best to tell the truth. There's no love your neighbor. Treat other people as yourself. It's not rocket science. That's the core of the whole thing. Now, that's for him, if you like, the natural law. It's consistent with how we should behave on the earth and in the other world, the karmic sense, the sense that when you go to the next world or near-death experience, you get this sense of the influence you had on other people. You become aware of the impact you had on other people. This principle is embedded in the universe. So he says that what we did was we adhered to the Tao, but now humans have said that we can use our sorcerous powers of science to control the world, to control human nature, to control the universe, to control God, to reject God, to become gods ourselves. And what he was talking about is manifest today in Yuval Noah Harari, etc. We become gods. And by definition, when they become gods, the other humans become something lesser than gods, and they become subject to their control. So there is a common underpinning of the theological positions of different cultures. Now, what we have to do is to begin to ignore our differences and look at the commonalities. I'm not saying, look at, they're all the same, they're not all the same. And not denying the problems or whatever, but saying, okay, let's transcend this until we get this in order, until we get a balance. And the way we do it operationally is that as people become made aware and conscious of the issues, they can act as a unit in their own way, from their own lifestyle, from their own knowledge. Because if you think in the traditional way of a guerrilla army, and a lot of the guerrilla warfare tactics were developed in Ireland because they didn't have resources and they had to operate. But what the guerrilla army needed was a support of the people. You needed a kind of homogenous population, which is one of the reasons why they're changing the population in Ireland, so that they won't have a homogenous thing. So you can't make assumptions about what your neighbor might think because you don't know them. So that's one of the reasons why there is this drive towards heterogeneity, to stop people combining, which is another reason we have to get out of our what compartments, get out of our skin color, religion, whatever, and recognize that we're all spiritual individuals and that every spiritual individual is being threatened. And at that stage, then people have an incentive to begin to report on things they see, whistleblow, disclose, explain, communicate, interact across boundaries. It's unpredictable for the forces to have made assumptions, because they've probably made assumptions about now that there will be violent resistance. I mean, there is in France, it's getting in, but they have predicted, they may have anticipated it before, there will be violent resistance against it. But the problem is, of course, that it's an amorphous mass to fight against. It's not clear. And also, they have developed so much automatic warfare, robots, etc., that it's getting easier and easier for them to win. And even though you have your guns in the United States and all that, the technological balance is shifting in favor of the mass, the people that can use mass violence. And of course, the United States government has no problem in using violence, and it certainly won't have any problem using violence against its own citizens, because the United States is disintegrating. I mean, it's not part of the plan that it will stay. It is disintegrating. It has been disintegrating for a while. That it didn't exist that long in historical terms, and it's not going to exist in the current state. It's not going to exist for much more. And so, for example, we know that the Judeo-Christian culture is ending, and people seem to be very happy about that. But I would ask them, you're happy about that, not you, Evan, but people are happy about that. This has been the basis of governance in Europe and in the United States in its existence. So when you take that away, when you take the God out of it, when you take the Judeo-Christian basis out, what option have you got left? There's only a few possibilities left. Which will you choose from? You can have Sharia, which is a jurisprudential system. It will appeal to most people. It will appeal to most people over being run by criminal cartels, drug gangs. That's what happens in systems that don't have. It's happening in Mexico. You have another lovely option with communism or the scientocracy. There's only a few possibilities. So which one do you want to choose? this is the reality of the consequence. So when people are saying, "Oh, we're delighted getting rid of all this old Christian stuff and God and all that," you're going to have to pay the consequences of the decisions and the things that you have made. This is what's going to happen. There will be order in the end. The problem is the order you get won't be something that you may like. So what I'm saying in that is you have to be very careful about doing the dirty work for the people that want to destroy spiritual traditions. Right. Because you can easily be forwarding weak arguments, ill thought out arguments, which are destructive and which contribute towards the destruction of the existing society. And for young people, for example, a lot of young people don't understand when they're promoting communism, etc. They don't understand. They're told it's about people, the poor people, and about people that are downtrodden. They're not told about all the hundreds of millions of people that are being killed. They're not told that when some of the organizations in the United States were discussing the future in the United States, they were discussing the execution of 20 million people, and that was in the 60s. If you listen to people, a lot of people in America say, "Oh, Christopher Hitchens, he's a wonderful man. He's so clever. He's so intelligent." Now, Christopher Hitchens, for example, he would have thought that Mother Teresa was something like a kind of terrorist, and people bought this argument that she was a really nasty person. It was a total inversion. And Christopher, he was a communist, and his brother has said that our vision was that we would have to wade through a sea of blood to get to paradise. This is the agenda. You have to accept the consequences of what the people have told you these things are. So what I'm saying is that if we don't begin to find our commonality in spiritual consciousness and begin to support each other, aware of what the danger is, we don't have any hope in the thing. Right. It has to be a mass organization, which is no organization, which can't be taken over, which is based on adherence to certain principles, which is aware how the system operates, which is not dependent on any individual. I'll give you another example about, there was a mass, in the 1840s in Ireland, there was a movement for Catholic emancipation because Catholics were excluded from public office, etc. So there was a mass movement because they were the majority, and it was one of the major mass movement, political movements, or the first of its type in the world. So you had the hundreds of thousands of people met around Daniel O'Connell, who was non-violent leader, wanted to liberate people without using violence. He was a guide for Gandhi and other people afterwards. And but in the last meeting, when they were moving on, 1843, he had a meeting planned in Clontarf in Dublin. And Clontarf was where the Irish had defeated the Vikings in 1014, so it's kind of symbolic. So the British government brought in ships and navy and a lot of military, and they put a lot of pressure on them to call it off. So that movement was diffused by the significance of individuals being able to control individuals. So we cannot have any organizations which are dependent on particular individuals that can be captured, and that's why there has to be a mass conscientization, if you like, of people. It's going to have to be something that never existed before, based on a few principles, based on clear analysis, that predicts what's going to happen, that analyzes, that's based on clear principles, that's loving in its nature. Now, when we talk about love, that's another example. People use the word love. We have to get specific about that. C.S. Lewis wrote about that as well, about the different types of love, from storge, eros, philia, and agape. You know, the difference between affection, loving your family, loving your friend, or this general divine type love, which is not based on it's not transactional. And then you also have another type, a simulacrum, the love that you read about in pop songs. It's hard if you sit down to write a pop song about love, but this is a meaningless term about something that happens on Saturday night. It's not really about any deeper concept, you know what I mean? So some of these words, we have to really think about them. But so in summary, that any response addressing a force which attempts to revoke humanity, to end humanity as we know it, through attacking the spirit, through attacking spiritual consciousness, it should be a resistance which is predicated on the protection of spiritual consciousness, in particular against or in the context of a totalitarian technical system, which is centralized, which is not diverse in any real sense. And it has to be done on the basis of respecting other people's spiritual origin, not looking at the differences and looking at our commonality and understanding that everyone's spiritual consciousness is under threat. And whatever differences they have, and not to allow ourselves be divided. The United States it's the one that has promoted extreme Islam, for example. That's quite established. It's the one. Saudi Arabia promotes it as well. All this surplus profits, it's been used to create weaponized religion, and then they say, "Oh, look at these guys." That, you know, so you have to be careful about that. Knowing that religion was one of the targets. So they'd be the main. And again, if we do have this notion of something organic, something mass, something unorganized, something uncapturable, based around a few principles, which begins to work out through interaction between a range of people, which makes sense because it makes analytical sense. It's stateable in a few propositions. Well, then I think that's the only option really available, having looked at all the historical examples and all the predicated on the basis that we're talking about non-violent solution.
Right. And I absolutely agree with you. And I think, it seems to start with almost a deepening of the spiritual traditions for whatever tradition somebody is in, whether it is that Christian Judeo belief system or Islam, or New Age, whatever it may be, to getting to the deeper fundamental aspects of that. And when you start to do that, you really do recognize the perennial philosophy that is present within all of them. I mean,
Yes.
each religion is going to have differences based on its cultural origin and influence and the backgrounds of it. And what's interesting is we see this promotion of diversity within society, but again, it's sort of an inverted idea of diversity where we're going to promote race or difference in race, and we're going to promote LGBTQ, whatever, all of these different ideas where we're talking about this need for tolerance, and we're talking about this need for the acceptance of difference. And I think, in particularly, a lot of young people, they go along with certain ideologies because they want to be open, because they want to be tolerant, without recognizing how, these top-down agendas, when a movement or activism is driven from a top-down approach as opposed to generated from within the individual, that activism in itself is laced with an agenda and end goal in mind, instead of being something that is generated seeking true change. I think there's this weaponization of empathy itself, this weaponization of people attempting to be more tolerant and attempting to be more open. And I think that's where a lot of people certainly get stuck. But if we were to deepen in our own individual traditions and start to really unpack a lot of these, the stories and the myths that have brought society to where it is today. I mean, I think a lot of people don't even understand. And, I think there's more we can all continue to learn, myself included. What is the true meaning and what is the true myth of the Judeo-Christian belief system that is underpinning society and underpinning our the system that we have created, right? And what does it truly mean to have divine worth, right? If you look in uh, the system of the law, why is it that we don't take a prisoner and bring him out for execution in the town square immediately after being found guilty? Is because even the criminals, we recognize there is this divine worth within their being, within their existence, that we honor. And so when and that's a part of the Judeo-Christian belief system that is intertwined within our culture, right? So when you pull the rug out from the entire tradition, I don't think people recognize that a lot of our cultural norms and standards have been generated from that. And a lot of the ways that we act, we don't necessarily understand the deeper origin of a lot of these principles. So I think a deepening of the actual traditions themselves can lead to a deeper understanding of what a perennial of the meaning of like the perennial philosophy and what it is that actually interconnects all of these diverse viewpoints. You can't really have I would say an acceptance of diversity within oneself until you begin to recognize all of the different aspects that make up who we are, and all of the different what are the myths that are operating on my own unconscious mind, and who it is that I am, and the systems that I have been brought within, and how I'm operating. Because then and we start to recognize it's so complex and so diverse and so unique. Then you can really go out into the world and recognize that everybody has that own individual uniqueness, and there begins to generate a reverence, and we can really celebrate that, as opposed to really this surface level tolerance and surface level push for diversity that we're seeing within society. I think we definitely need to move beyond I think individuals, they may have good intentions, but as the cliches tend to be true. I guess there's a reason we say them. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? It's because we don't, if we allow ourselves to be driven strictly by emotion, and we're captivated by what we're seeing in the external world and the movements that are pushed upon us, and the ideologies that are pushed upon us. As I mentioned earlier with communism, the way it's promoted is they promote unity and they promote fairness and equality, when the reality is we don't, as you mentioned, we don't talk about the millions upon millions of people that are killed, and the destruction that actually comes with the implementation of that type of system. So I think we really need to start to look at the deeper roots here and the deeper meanings within oneself, and then that will, in a way, it almost feels like the solution, and what you're talking about, this natural resistance. When we talk about like the masses, it's interesting because I've been thinking about that term in particular a lot lately, and a lot of people seem stumped on why is it that we can't wake up the masses, or why can't the masses be influenced. And really, I think we have to recognize masses. When we say the masses, it's not the masses, it's a reflection of the collective unconscious. It's a reflection of the collective conscious as well, and where it is that we are resonating with, and where we are the majority of people are at. So the only way to change the masses is to change the individuals who make up the masses, and then the masses begin to reflect that changed individual state of awareness, as opposed to trying to make these grand scale changes and persuade masses, kind of like what you talked about with the flock of birds, and they have that direct impact on the 7 other birds around them. Well, if I'm one of those birds, and then I have 7 birds around me, well, one of those 7 birds is going to have 7 other birds around them, and that another. So that's how we really have to, I think, approach making that type of change, instead of trying to be almost viewing ourselves as some sort of prophet who needs to persuade the masses and become this this cult of personality type of leader, or take on this global change when I think it all starts directly in front of us. And
that's right. Yeah. And another image on that is that this is top down stuff that they're doing. They're coming from the top down, and they do that through organizations, and that's their technique, and they take on countries and whatever. And we see it at the World Economic Forum. So the opposing movement is like a stalagmite up from the ground. So this will be building up from the ground, and maybe the two systems will eventually cancel each other out if we have sufficient force coming up against it. Because if it controls all the way down, well, we're gone. You raised a few issues there, as you usually do. Have to address, or I'll suggest another way of explaining in a way that I was thinking about. But just to refer to a few points that you gave rise to there, they're going towards a zero trust society, and what they've been very successful is breaking down trust. For example, the feminist movement divided men and women, so that now the problem actually will be that a lot of men have been led into a situation where they don't trust women in general. This is you have all these men going their own way and all this kind of stuff, and all this different incel, all those different kind of movements, because of this advance of a particular argument. I'm not talking about just equality or whatever like that, but it's the effort has been to breach trust between, and some of that will never be restored. So that makes it easier to divide society. And then then you go in the groups, and in women you have the divisions between trans and women, and what is a woman, and all this kind of stuff. There's more division in that context. That's part of the agenda, to break trust funny enough, by trusts, international corporations. They're called the trusts. So we get the corporate trust, the fascist trust, that will replace societal trust. And you can't do things without trust, without people that you rely on. It's very, very interesting when I hear young people, and I was talking to someone, and in school they had a visit to the Catholic Church, and I was asking them what type of questions they had, and I said a lot of people were asking about the church's attitude towards gay people, and they seemed to have a very negative view of the church's role in relation to gay people. But the interesting thing is that if you look at it from an actual historical perspective, and you look at anti or gay criminalization around the world, 2/3 to 3/4 of it came from the British Empire. It was spread through the British Empire at a time when they were advocating science after the theory of evolution. That's fact from people that have studied it and went through it. So now you have people going and saying, I saw Stephen Fry in a program, and he was out in Africa, and he was complaining about the church's role in but it was the British Empire that he's from who did this. So we have an inversion there in relation to that. It wasn't the Catholic Church that spread it through the British Empire. So we have all these strange abilities to change the narrative. It's like, for example, now there used to be, if we go back to my generation, they said the main force that was driving this global thing was the WASPs, and particularly in America, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So they've taken out the Anglo-Saxon Protestant and just blamed the white people, so they can blame the poor people on it as if they were responsible. It's a brilliant tactic that people allow them. So all the poor white people that went over and fought in the wars and were sent out and worked in difficult conditions, they can be the oppressors, even though they were often sent out or forced to go out of their homeland. So they're brilliant at dividing people, as is happening in Ireland now in relation to a country that wasn't a colonial power, that was colonized, and it's now being kind of blamed as a colonial power. So you have all these successful efforts to split people up. So we can't allow ourselves to be split up by distortions of history. So it's very, very important to read proper history, accepting that a lot of the history now that's being published is propaganda. It really is propaganda. And if they try and destroy and remove genuine history, so people have to get into the libraries before they disappear in the memory hole. I was talking to a group of people on St. Patrick's Day about St. Patrick. St. Patrick was a slave. When I went into the museum, the Voodoo Museum in New Orleans, there was a statue of St. Patrick there. So I said to the woman, well, what's he doing here as a matter of interest? Well, they said we had a god in West Africa that had power over snakes, and he had power over snakes, and he was a slave like us. So they could identify with. But he fought against slavery, and all the early Christian church in Ireland fought against slavery. In the year 697, Adomnan, who was a relation of St. Columba, got an international conference in Ireland in the year 697, and they established a legal code for the protection of women and children in the event of war and non-combatants in the year 697. This was well before the Geneva Convention. This is where the rights were coming from through structures like this. So as people are saying, I will abolish this, and they're buying cheap propaganda models of the history, simplified ones that suit the purpose of materialist agendas, they're throwing away their own rights in this. So you're left in a situation. For example, if I say to you, okay, we'll take God out of the equation, we'll take Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman thing out of the equation, and I say we've decided that we're going to, well, I don't want to make it personal to you, Evan, but we say to a person, okay, we've decided, or the computer has decided, we're taking your life away because you're a useless eater, whatever like that, and the computer has said. And then you say, well, okay, well, in a totalitarian state, you won't have any right to object. But imagine if they did give you a basis to appeal to, or they said, okay, the computer says, give us a philosophical argument why you shouldn't die, and you're not able to rely on God or Judaism or Christianity or the Greco-Roman philosophical. What basis is your appeal to your life on? It's a very limited basis. And in fact, if you read Ivan Illich, he says the concept of life itself, and he was critical of the church, although he had been a priest. He said the concept of life itself, the only origin of it in its true sense, it comes from Christianity. He said it didn't exist in that form. The idea of protection of life, or life itself, was a peculiarly Christian form, for example, that came from that tradition. So we have to be really, really careful in what we concede, what territory we concede, because we're not paying attention, because we're spending too much time watching television or Netflix or eating popcorn or whatever. And another way of saying it, to build on another example that C.S. Lewis used, he said in relation to society, so we're going to explain the mass element. He said it's like a fleet of ships which is going somewhere together. So as an individual, you're in charge of your own ship. So your job is to make sure the ship doesn't sink, to direct it in the right way, and not to bump into other ships, to keep it seaworthy, to avoid any obstacles. Okay, so that if you like represents the state that you have control over, your own personal, I would say. Your relationship with others then is critical. So you have to kind of pay attention to the other people in the fleet, because they're doing their own thing, but we assume they're going in the same direction. And of course, where they're going, the destination is the aim of the, if you like, the social movement or the mass. So that's a pretty good description of it. Now, I would add to that, just to try and develop that in relation to what we're talking about. We could, what a ship has on it is described as the manifest. And so the manifest, we're talking associate, coming from the Latin, to show with the hands, are things you do with the hands, to make things, to manifest things. a manifest is a thing when we assess ourselves. Psychologically, we have to assess our own place, physically, our own place mentally, and our own place spiritually. We have to look after it. We have to take responsibility for ourselves. We have to, in control of our own ship, take command, be the commander of the ship, and also, in order to do so, be cognizant of the manifest, what we're carrying, what we need to discard, what we have. And going in the same direction, another word associated with manifest is a manifesto. So the place we're going, and again, that's where the big principles that have been suggested, that we're talking about the preservation of Homo sapiens, not moving towards a post-human society, not discarding the human, and in that is the protection of spiritual consciousness against a totalitarian system that's hostile to the human, that wants to remove the human, that sees the as a parasite, as destructive of nature. I mean, they use different arguments all the time. The environmental argument is being used against us, but it could be something else. So there has been a co-opting of the green agenda. So it's a bit like when they put the dye in St. Patrick's Day in Chicago in the river. There's a greenwashing of the political currents to turn it into something that it's not. Whereas really they're using that as a cover for building a control agenda and to move away from any commitments towards any real economy. So if we begin to think in those terms, we can get some model and also begin to say, well, which model doesn't fit? For example, a lot of younger people in particular, not just younger people, some of my own contemporaries, were explaining to me for a long time about how BitChute or Bitcoin and all these currencies were the way forward. And I was very skeptical. I understand a decentralized currency, but really your governments, the corporate functions have been working on this, and they're happy to use you as guinea pigs to work out their systems. But the idea that with a computer and a system that you're going to be able to escape is a kind of fanciful idea. It's an illusion that technical people are often subjected to, the idea that they will be able to escape with their technology. So some of the systems are merely furthering the aims of these other systems. We have to get critical. And the last point on that, if you say about technology, that one of the descriptions of this or that fits in with the spiritual consciousness or any kind of invisible army is the idea of techno rebels. Now, if Alvin Toffler in the 1980s, so that's nearly 40 years ago, anticipated that there would be a group called what that he called techno rebels. Now, these were not, again, in a non-violent context. So he said what would happen would be that we have the growth of technology and all the people that love technology. You know, a lot of people love technology. A lot of people worship technology. They really do worship technology. They adore technology. They would put technology above anything else. It's not an accident that they call, these things apples, going back to Genesis, etc. That's no accident. So it is as significant as that. So you have this group that love technology. And then you would have people that would say, oh, I don't like any of that stuff. The Luddites, the people that are against it, etc. The people that didn't want to go ahead with technology. But he said there would be a third group, which were the determinative group. And these would be the techno rebels. These would be people who understand technology, but don't like the use of it. They would object to the military-industrial complex, etc. And he accurately predicted this group of techno rebels. So that idea of techno rebellion, of people that are aware and able to operate in the infrastructure, the technostructure, but are very critical of it and wants to control it, is a feature of any mass movement, because the idea that they're going to be able to operate in the same way is not there. So that techno rebel element is an element that has been predicted by futurologists, and Toffler in this case, and I think it's an accurate description. And it also is a pragmatic, another word, term I've used for years is pragmatic cosmopolitanism. Like, you be pragmatic, but you be cosmopolitan. You recognize every individual as equal, and you recognize that someone in Indonesia could influence your life tomorrow or today or yesterday, and you could influence someone's life in India or whatever. We're citizens of the world now, whether we like it or not, but we have to be pragmatic about that. So, so if whatever model we get in our head, it will be about, in the ship example, controlling that state and the higher influence in other states, and influence the general state through our interaction. A similar analogy to the murmuration as part of a broader unified force, which cooperate on the basis of some shared view about technology, not seeking to deny technology, but seeking really to control it for human interest, and to put proper limitations on it, and to be willing to struggle for that. Because last point is that there's a novel written about transhumanism whereby Istvan, who's a promoter of transhumanism, anticipates there will be a war between transhumanists and people that want to stop them. So they're anticipating already. I'm not advocating violence, but what I'm saying is we have to anticipate this struggle. And I'm not against individuals choosing what to do with their bodies. That's up to themselves. But I don't want them choosing what to do with my body. Thank you very much. Or yours, Evan.
Right.
So I want the people, and in the recent precedent with all that health stuff that's gone on for the last few years, they have established a precedent that they can, in a short space of time, close down the world and have engaged in mass intervention in the human body. They have established that. So, and that's going to happen again. They're preparing to do that again, and they'll be less resistant, not more this time. They'll be less resistant because they'll be better at it. So the resistance has to happen before then. If it goes on the current trajectory, there's been a lot of tolerance, actually, despite all the scientific evidence coming out, there's been more tolerance than one would have hoped of all the terrible things that happened. There hasn't been as much, and there's a lot of people believing, oh, now we're seeing through it. It's not an accurate representation. There has to be a lot more awareness of the abuse of science, the abuse of technology, the abuse of health, iatrogenics, the abuse of medicine, before we move on as well.
Right, and I absolutely agree. And I think it's an interesting, especially just on the individual level, an interesting balance to try and figure out what is the appropriate level of condemnation versus forgiveness on the individual level, especially because, we talk about this, you're talking about this potential war that would come between transhumanists and the people who are against transhumanism. I mean, we saw in the last few years how within one's own family, people are pitted against one another, right? I mean, the family historically has been the strongest structure for cohesiveness within groups of people, right? I mean, even if you are ostracized from maybe society, you can still fall back upon within your own family and those around you, directly around you, to still have a level of support. But I mean, when we have such the ideologies are so divisive in a way where you have your own family members wanting to force an intervention into your own body, where do you fall back on for support? And now that that's almost come and gone, especially when you have people who are directly around you, what is that level of forgiveness that's necessary for maybe people who just sat back idly by, versus a level of condemnation? What are the types of conversations that need to be had so that we can continue to gain a deeper awareness for when this does happen again, and we can recognize when we're being pitted against one another? Because the people, like you're saying, the people who don't want the forced intervention, I'm in the same boat as you, where, I mean, if somebody wants to attempt to upload their soul to a hard drive and go off into the transhumanist
mm,
false ether of immortality, whatever we want to call it, um, by all means, I'm not going to stop them from doing so. I believe
mm,
they have the right to make that decision. I would certainly advise against it, and
mm,
I wouldn't recommend it.
mm,
But it doesn't feel like it's my place to tell them to. They can't do that. Oh, you don't have the ability to make that
mm,
decision for yourself. Whereas when
mm,
the inversion of that is the opposite side, and I hesitate to even say sides because I don't want to pit people against one another. But naturally, there are almost two paths emerging, if you will. The opposite of that is the people who are very pro science and pro intervention and have this vision for what humanity is supposed to be. There is, when you disregard the individual, and when you say humans are hackable animals, by the very nature of that, by the very nature of the ideologies that are promoted, there is no room for individual decision making, and so they're going to have those forced uh, interventions. You're right. It's almost very naive when people think that we beat certain mandates or we beat certain parts of the agenda. I mean, maybe like maybe it didn't advance in such a way that everybody got forced into
mm,
medical procedures, certainly.
mm,
um, but if anything, the powers that be in the system and they learned from it. They know how people responded the first time, and so there's going to be different strategies moving forward. And so we need to be very aware about how that's going to continue. And it feels like a lot of people have moved back almost into a sense of complacency and just, oh, we're doing all right, we're fine. And maybe that's just because of a lack of general awareness of what the end goal actually is. Like we talked about earlier, maybe there isn't that cohesive vision on this is where the agenda is taking mankind, the end goal, and there isn't the awareness of how those stories that they're telling about mankind and how their mankind is viewed. Maybe there's that lack of awareness is what creates that complacency, because they almost kind of what you talked about earlier, where Jordan Peterson labels things as mistakes. People view
mm,
it as, oh, they made a mistake and they're going to learn from it, and we
mm,
don't need to worry about that anymore because
mm,
don't you worry. It's just that idea that they think the system has their best interest in mind, when
mm,
that's really far from the case. So I think there's a lot of difficult conversations that need to be had amongst people, and a acceptance of reality and what the future holds, if we're actually going to create a resistance to it at first, right? We really need to
mm,
understand that this is uh, far from over in terms of a lot of the ideologies that are being pushed on us and the types of interventions that are going to take place. And I don't think that's necessarily addressed in a lot of circles necessarily,
mm,
at least not that I'm seeing.
mm. Yeah, I mean, Jesus said that about dividing families, and I think that was a description of what would happen, and it would happen as a result of a split between people that believe they're spiritual beings and part of a bigger thing, and people that don't. Now, if you believe that you're a spiritual being, you're not going to give up. You'll give up your life, your physical, for that thing. An example that comes to mind: my father's uncle. I spoke to. I remember speaking to one of my father's uncle who was in prison as well and escaped through IRA, all that kind of stuff. And his brother was in prison. He was in 12 prisons in Britain as a Republican, but he was in a prison in Wales, and one of his fellow who shared a dorm with him. It was a fellow called Terence MacSweeney, who was Lord Mayor of Cork, and he went on a hunger strike, and he was 74 days, and he died. And he was influential in relation to Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh. It was a big international event, so it's a hard thing to do, to allow your body eat itself, really. But during that, he was a very religious man, so he would have taken communion every day from the priests. They wouldn't have been able to do that without their spiritual belief. They were willing to, and this is what was understood by people like Gramsci, they were willing to go to any trial and tribulation because they believed in the permanence of their and survival of their spirit. So therefore, whatever pain, and there was a lot of pain inflicted over hundreds of years in Ireland, was inflicted on them. They were going to survive because and through the famine. I talking to an old man, and he was telling me about how the family survived, or our family, in the famine, and in the context of 1 million people killed in Ireland. So we've seen this before. This is not that far back. And Daniel O'Connell died in 1843. 2 years later, the famine started, and it was detected first in the Royal Society's Botanic Gardens in Dublin. Kind of reminds me a bit of like a lab, actually, in the way I'm not making any points, but massive starvation. Why? Because people were made dependent on an alien crop, and potatoes in this from South America are made dependent on it, poor people. Once you're made dependent on something, you're vulnerable to whatever happens. And now you don't have to be a genius to work out that the food supply is being broken down, and that it can only lead to starvation. There has to be starvation. And this is a policy that has been used by empires for a long time, and certainly will be used to automate the food chain so that you can get your vaccines in your lettuce. That's what they've told you. But I mean, the attack on the food supply is utterly consistent with what happened in the Soviet Russia, and this is happening again. And there's a curious correspondence that this happened in Russia, of course, and attacking the kulaks and the producers of food. And before that, it's interesting because a lot of people, when they're talking about Jewish history, they say, oh, the Jews and the Bolsheviks. But the main Jewish body in the socialist movement in Russia was excluded in the Bolshevik convention. They excluded the Jewish farmers. So when looking at the figures, there was a mass that were excluded from the political machinations of the Bolsheviks. But when you start attacking farmers, you're getting into tyranny. You're getting into tyrannous situation, and it's clear what's happened in the Netherlands is an attack on culture, on food supply, on the second most productive country in the world, and it's very, very sinister and very, very dangerous, and there can't be a good result. But if you're a Malthusian, you can say, oh, this is great because this balances population by the reduction. I mean, this is the way they think about this. I mean, there's statements by eminent people in Britain during the Irish famine saying that it would be more likely to see, as they called it, a red Indian on the banks of the Liffey in Dublin than an Irishman soon. I mean, that was their hope to clear people out of Ireland, and they had, as well as the genocides that happened during the Tudor ranges. So if one believes that these people have gone away, they're sadly mistaken. If one believes that there's some benign force out there, they're sadly mistaken. If they haven't seen or haven't noticed that a lot of the international organizations were peopled by people who were from the imperial background, where the empire was transmuted, not just the British Empire, in conjunction with the other royal families, empires, corporations, coming together to achieve their objectives. But I agree with you. I don't care what people do to their body. In fact, I have a friend in Barcelona who's saying that he talked to this chap over there, Neil, I forget the surname, and he's a cyborg. He has a thing in his head that enables him to see different colors. He's one of the early cyborgs. He seems like a very nice man. I'd be very interested in talking to him. I'd no objection to him. And he's fighting for the rights of cyborgs because it's coming. No, I have no objection to whatever he wants to stick into his head and whatever medical operations he does. But again, I don't want any precedent set to enable him to stick things into my head. And whatever he does is up to himself. And I'm sure the man's a very nice man, and I'll get on fine with him. And because I'd accept him as a spiritual individual, and as an individual who has worth and dignity in themselves. But that's beside the point about mass network transhumanism, which is non-consensual, which is predicated on the convenience of an administrative system, building on the Chinese model, building on the Anglo-American surveillance model. So what people have to do is to persuade other people. So we have to have a very strong argument. We have to persuade other people, and we have to, by example, explain to people why one thing is better than other. And part of that is also respecting the spiritual consciousness and also the value of spirituality. There's been a big shift in my lifetime to this idea of mental health, which is a synonym for mental ill health. So if they use it again and again and again in order to. Now, I'm not saying that people don't have medical problems, mental health problems, but a lot of mental health problems are spiritual problems, are manifestations of deeper spiritual issues that are not going to be addressed, as Alcoholics Anonymous indicates, as people like Russell Brand would attest to, that a claim to divine thing is a solution to the problem. And here's a very interesting example to show the difference. There's a lot of male figures who, in order to receive, if you like, a platform, have to present their mental illness or their mental health weakness. So when you have a strong male thing, they have to, in order to be accepted by this system, the propaganda model, they have to show that a strong man is not really strong at all. And there's two examples to show a contrast and a different approach. Again, Jordan Peterson, the poor man had his mental problems and his breakdown and all, but he does say as well, which is a bit disturbing, that he didn't know what was happening for a few months, and then he comes back on, and you say, well, okay, well, if you're becoming a world leader and all, it's a bit concerning when you come back then with your military guys around you. But and also, it's interesting that he never really. He said he acts as if God exists. Now, I'm not saying that people have to, but it's interesting that he doesn't claim spirituality as the basis. He claims the mind and things associated with myth, but he'll never go forward and say, well, actually there's a spiritual base to all this. He avoids it. Even in fairness to Russell Brand asked him about, there's a spiritual basis and he wouldn't bite on that. And again, that's in defense of Russell Brand. Russell Brand has moved a lot on that, to his credit. He deserves a lot of credit for that. So contrast that with Tyson Fury. So Tyson Fury, his father's into conspiracy theories, and Tyson Fury was kind of communicating a few of these, just critical things. And then the media turned against him. He was vilified. And then he came back. He was on the agenda. Okay, but the mental health issue had to be there. And there seems to be a kind of implied quid pro quo there, like, you know what I mean, that will accept you in certain conditions. Because of course here you have a man who's brought up largely outside the system. His family are Irish travellers, so he's not really in the system, but yet he emerges as a big strong man who's 6'9" and becomes world heavyweight champion. It doesn't really fit the idea that we're being well looked after on the inside. If he's fighting Deontay Wilder, who also comes from kind of underprivileged background, if you like, and he's 6'7" and looking healthy, it's an interesting issue. But he went through and describes being suicidal and all that and needing help. That's I understand that, but it's very, very interesting when he tells the story. He said that he went down on his knees and asked God for help, and that was the turning point. So although he got the medical help, he emphasized his strong spiritual belief. And this is the thing that goes back to the Psalms. St. Patrick quotes the thing about going down. George Foreman did the same thing. So that spiritual thing is not emphasized in those two cases with the strong men. If you like, I'm very impressed with Fury for his sticking to his spiritual beliefs and applying them when he needed it, and showing the relationship between spiritual beliefs and dealing with mental health. And because there's a big effort to say, okay, well, it's not really a mental issue, it's a pharmaceutical issue, it's a chemical issue, and you need the help of us. I mean, get on to Pfizer, get on to all the people that sponsor the news, etc., who sponsor those guys doing their satanic stuff on the ads and all that. Yeah, we look after you. I don't think so. So the other element about Tyson Fury, I probably mentioned before the fight with Deontay Wilder, they had that debate where they're talking about being possessed, and Fury realizes that Deontay Wilder is saying that a spirit comes into him, and Fury says that he's going to defeat him because of that, because he's a Christian. So you have this interesting real belief in the spiritual world, whatever. In his case, he's Christian, but that's a very real thing. It's a very important part of the equation, and I think you'll see what's happening now. I won't be surprised that the movement that's associated with Peterson and others will be to present some simulacrum of Judeo-Christian culture and talk about, I don't know, father figures and this, that, and the other, but without any real commitment to anything that will disturb the norm. And he says, Peterson says as well, that, well, if you can prove that you can look after your family and your community and your town or whatever, then maybe we'll let you participate. I was thinking, well, who are you to? Who is he to? Who gave him a basis to determine about what other people do, to please him in accordance with? These people don't have a constituency. They may have a corporatist created constituency, but they don't have a moral constituency to write the rules for the rest of us. So we have to come out of our own shell to move to the next thing and take responsibility for ourselves, and also say, hold on a second, we have something to say, but we do have to have something to say. It's no good appearing at the table and not being able to say something, or just start talking about the football match. Or that's no point. That's proven the case that we're not capable of ruling ourselves, or capable of exercising sovereignty on an individual level, sovereignty on a national level, and sovereignty on a higher level. So we have to advance our game. We have to get articulate. We have to begin to really focus on the key things, and also begin to, because spirituality has been, although they say there's a lot of people now who are spiritual but not religious, there's a kind of taboo about, being a spiritual person. There's a taboo about people that follow religions and say, there's a hostility towards them. Like, take the Catholic example. It's the oldest prejudice in the world. They used to feed them to the lions. It's going on throughout history, but it's totally legitimate to say, all Catholics are whatever, this, that, and the other, and utilize evidence presented in the media to tar all Catholics with the same brush. You can't say that about other groups of people. It's just endemic and we don't even notice it, and it's even trendy to do so, and it's programmed into us automatically to criticize certain people. But the divisions will happen, and the divisions may be intended to happen. If we're going to have spiritual evolution, certain people don't want to, and they don't, well, then they have to take the consequences of that, and they have to go wherever they're going to go. They don't believe they're going anywhere, but they may be, and they may be going to, that they have to pay the price of whatever we all have to.
Absolutely. Well, and I find it very interesting, the taboo that you just mentioned against spirituality and religious belief, and I would say religious knowing, spiritual knowing, and a deeper understanding of it. It's very paradoxical in a lot of ways, and it's almost as if this taboo is created from the top down, while simultaneously, and this is something you mentioned. I listened to one of the recent podcasts with Jeffrey Mishlove about the crystallization, the sorcerers of spirituality and of really I'd say the power within spirituality and these hidden I don't know if forces is the right word, but the wielders of that and the ones who have taken advantage of that typically are the people in positions of power and the ones who are operating these systems of control, and they use it in a way to further their own power, their own control mechanisms, whatever it may be, right? So you have this inversion that's created where, and this is certainly present within today. If you look at the Hollywood, and I was watching something on studying a lot about symbolism, and even the name Hollywood. If you look at the origins of what wands were made out of, they were made out of holly trees, right? And so it was a holly wood, that's what a wand is, Hollywood. So it's magic, it's spells, it's programming, right? So there is
to Ireland and Britain as well. That's correct, yeah.
Right, and so there's this deep underpinning and notion. A lot of this is all rooted in spiritual concepts and magic, and a knowing of how that operates and how it works and the impact it has on us as spiritual beings. It's integrated within our systems, but hidden in such ways that you only begin to pick up on it when you recognize within yourself your own spiritual, your own identification as a spiritual being and what we're actually capable of. And then you start to recognize the symbology and really symbols or language of the unconscious mind. So the symbolism, it's just our unconscious manifesting, then it's really the foundation of who we are. So the taboo, it's a very fascinating paradox and inversion that's taking place. And I think it's obviously only going to continue to take place as these agendas roll out. But I think a reclamation of our own spiritual identity is that first step, and breaking past the taboo of spirituality and of religion, and almost a radical devotion to recognizing oneself as a spiritual being. I mean, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. You can say Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris. I know they had many debates in the past, but in a way, they were kind of saying the same thing, because I mean, Jordan Peterson was more arguing on the foundation being within the Judeo-Christian belief system, but he wasn't arguing for the presence of divinity necessarily, right? And you see how both of their ideologies have led them to where they are in presently. So it's just it's very fascinating to look at how, even if we're going to look at resistance movements, we're going to look at alternative viewpoints, if they're not rooted in the foundation and the recognition of divinity and the presence of spiritual consciousness, they're going to still give way to this totalitarianism that is emerging on a global scale. So I think the resistance does have to be rooted in individual spirituality and individual spiritual consciousness, and the system may never accept somebody if they choose to align themselves with that. I mean, I think that question of explain your worth to the explain your life worth to the computer is a profound question to ask. I mean, if you're going to identify it as a spiritual being, then yeah, the computer is going to view you as a useless eater, and it's going to view you as obsolete. And it's like, what story would you, maybe if you're trying to survive, what story would you have to tell a computer versus what story would you have to tell some sort of higher power or God or divinity or the spiritual story of oneself, right? What are those two different modes of identification? What do they look like, and what actually brings a deeper sense of meaning and fulfillment and really purpose moving forward? And I think that's a great point of reflection people can have, and to really help articulate and unpack what their own individual path is moving forward, because I think the spiritual resistance is going to look different for every person.
Yeah. Now there is also a taboo about anything got to do with God, even though they'll use that in certain contexts, and in many ways they should be. If we go back to Judaism, there was taboos about using the name of God. So I understand that, and that's correct. And if you're talking about something that in some way is the greatest conception or the infinite, whatever, that misusing that is wrong. So I mean, it's remarkable. It's remarkable how many times, I mean, it's endemic in the society. Oh my God, from people at a time when they don't believe in God. I mean, it's a programming thing, and it also is a denigratory thing. It's intended to be. And even in science, all the great scientists coming together to form the grand unified theory, GUT. It's a bit of a cheap substitute, a grand unified theory, gut, God. It's a bit of a cod as well. Now, I've used different terms like the unbeknownst, for example, a capital U as a description of something to refer back to the idea of the incomprehensibility of the infinite. But I don't have a problem now with using God to refer to. I don't like hearing people banging on too much about as if there's only they have a special relationship with God and they know their and they begin to tell you that doesn't work for me at all. I think one has to be careful, especially about spiritual advocacy, about putting yourself in the position of God. That's not the way it works. Or creating idols, etc. These principles about idols and that are good ways of explaining what happens when you focus on something which is not the ultimate conception you can have. And in many early Christian Ireland, the idea of God was something which was beyond determination. You couldn't say anything. It's like neti and the kind of Hindu, not that and not that. It's something that was beyond comprehension. And in the Kabbalistic sense, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, God has withdrawn from the equation, and the light that remains, the divine sparks are here, but God has withdrawn from that. It's a similar thing in C.S. Lewis when he's talking about God. By definition, you can't have free will if God is intervening all the time. That's not the way it works directly about to manage things. It's not the way it works. And he wrote some very interesting, his last book, his work of fiction was Till We Have Faces, and the idea is based on a retelling of Greek legends, and there's an implication that until we develop our own spiritual face, really, we can't communicate with the gods or God, because they can't communicate with us. There's an idea that you have to work on your spiritual self in order to be able to enter into that world. So there's a lot of people talking in terms of a spiritual war going on, and I believe that to be true. Whatever perspective one comes at it, whether it comes from a Christian perspective or an Islamic perspective, or a whole range of perspectives, that more people are beginning to understand that there's something different to it. Or Charles Upton believes that some of this UFO stuff is associated with a demonic intervention. I mean, you could make this equation between certain non-human forces and demonic. But that's what they were anyway. A lot of the demons in Christianity and in Islam were referring to other beings that do exist. I believe that they do exist. They're ontologically real. I don't have any problem with that. And I'm quite convinced by the both Islamic and Catholic and Protestant perspective about spirits that can move into or beings that can move into human consciousness. And there's a fair few psychotherapists as well that accept that. And around that context, we have the idea of a spiritual war. And again, Ephesians, we fight not with flesh and blood, but against principalities. And Steiner talked about this, about the war which was reflected in the earth. And there's some sense that the astral plane is shifting into the mundane world, or the veil is becoming thinner, so that some beings can move closer because humans have been interacting more with them and they're opening themselves up to. So the extent of possession, according to the people that work in these areas, is increasing. There's a lot more people reporting things that would be spiritual possession or being harassed by spirits or any of these terms. And there's different ways that these beings. So I believe in those forces, and so do most of these people that have created the empire, that are kings and queens. They believe in these forces. Magicians were usually employed by the strongest people in society. If you have power, you don't want magicians to be against you, so you give them a job. That's why they're close. That's why you see the picture of John Dee and Queen Elizabeth, and he's performing a magical experiment. It was John Dee that conceived the British Empire. It was him that conceived the colonization of the east coast of America, using probably navigation and maps that they had got from the monasteries that they had stolen all the wealth from. So they utilized that technology and they applied it. But they're always associating with the spiritual dimension. King Charles will have his coronation, and you'll see a stone under his chair, a stone of destiny. It's supposedly an ancient stone, but it's there because it's testament to their belief in these type of things. They've never disappeared from, or they've never let go of these things. And the Swedish royal family were always interested in occult matters. The various secret societies that included the royals of Europe are well, they believe in spirits. There's no question about that. And you'll notice that a lot of the people who were key drivers that I've followed over the years, the key drivers in the globalization process, they will have a big list of awards behind their title, the order of this, the order of that, the order of the other, and they usually have some connection with some societies that have been around for a while and are effectively secret societies. So that connection is clearly there. They're not saying we don't believe in the spirit, but they're saying we believe in different spirits, and the spirits that we believe in are not the spirits that have been orthodoxly accepted in the mainstream world. So that's hard to resist, that idea. And when you're talking about the symbols, William Butler Yeats explains in his 1902 essay on the great on magic that the human interacts with the great memory, or the Akashic records, whatever you want to call it, or the astral plane, through symbols. So symbols are the key interaction between them. And these symbols, they're not accidental, because you'll see, for example, when they were investigating light with X-rays and various things, you keep seeing the same symbols, the Maltese cross, they keep coming up again and again and again. They're embedded in the universe in some way. They're not all bad or anything like that, but they're powerful, and there's consequences to them. But there's no question that there is a spiritual issue, and in this spiritual issue, the possession of the human soul is a prize Now you can see that you could identify that again in a Christian terms, being the objective of the demons, or C.S. Lewis would say that that's their objective, to bring you into the material world, and there's no better way to do that than to turn you into a totally material, controllable object. But it's not just confined to those dimensions. But I don't have any problem in. I don't have any doubt that these domains are ontologically real. It was only recently that we began not to believe in them. Right. In fact, a lot of C.S. Lewis's works are based on the medieval worldview. One of his last books of nonfiction was this discarded image, explaining that in medieval Europe there was a total worldview where everything was integrated, a really grand unified theory based on the planets that they knew and the sun and the moon, and that's been deconstructed. So we've lost that meaning again that you talk about. There was meaning, and the deconstruction of meaning makes it difficult for people to act together. So it makes you isolated. It can make you alienated. It make you feel not part of and not knowing where to go. You can rule people better when you alienate them. So there's a deliberate process of alienation, and the best way is to demoralize them. And to do that, you have to dispirit them. If a person has a strong sense of spirituality, they will endure the worst things, the worst physical pain, to protect their spirit. That's what the history of martyrdom has shown in all religious traditions. If they believe from a spiritual basis, they will forego and endure the worst things that can be done to the human body. But if you take the spirit away, it's a different kettle of fish. But so there's no doubt that there is this kind of, and that some of these techniques are designed to develop their own power, and also to confuse people, and to apply a type of mesmerism and fear, and inculcate certain emotions in ourselves.
Absolutely. And, as you're outlining this, I've read into Steiner about what he said as well, and to this almost merging of the astral and mundane. And it's very interesting because the timeline of him describing that in this emergence is very much synchronized with the timeline of this emergence of technocracy and the empire of scientism. And so to me, it's almost, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this. It's almost as if science and technology, and maybe you could say artificial intelligence, serves as a manifestation of those Ahrimanic forces. And you could argue it has spirit to it that is not human, but it is with the astral coming into the mundane, more of those demonic forces or dark forces taking form through technology, and capturing the human soul through technology has become that end goal, right? And it has become something that is becoming more of a possibility, and especially as technology continues to progress. And I think if we, with the disregard of the astral plane, and as it does become more, and I definitely agree with Steiner in that, I mean, obviously, I guess Evan, was not alive 250, 300 years ago. So I don't necessarily know the relation man had with spirit then. I mean, certainly if this astral, if this veil is thinning, as he talks about, the relation one had to spirit would be different than we perceive it now. But in the same sense, with this veil thinning, it feels as if we have the opportunity as well to grow spiritually to a point to where you have the the technologies and all of these so I guess soul capturing devices become present, we also simultaneously have the ability to grow to such a spiritual development that we have not previously had within our history. And I find it very interesting that there's almost, again, it's all aligned with like paradoxical and inversions. It seems to be the foundation of this taking place, because even though maybe the veil wasn't as thin and there was a deeper level of um, belief required in spiritual consciousness prior, there was more of an acceptance and knowing of it at the same time, versus now, if the veil is thin, the majority of people are choosing to look the other way and not acknowledge that spiritual consciousness, right? Even if it's right in front of them, as opposed to maybe in the past it wasn't as, and again, I wasn't alive then, I don't necessarily know. I mean, there was ways to connect with spirit, certainly. But as the age of the empire of scientism continues to emerge, we just have become more distracted. We've become more disconnected with who we are, and therefore disconnecting from the spiritual plane, even if we have greater access to it and greater access to our own spiritual abilities. It's just the distractions that are really allowing us to acquiesce, I would say. And but yeah, and I think I would say, go out on a limb and say the artificial intelligence has spirit to it that is dark in its nature and very much in alignment with what Steiner talked about in, you could call it fallen angels. There's a lot of different terms one could use to describe those dark forces. But to me, that's very much, when I sit with what that type of energy is, that's what it feels like in how I perceive it.
Although it likes Joe Biden.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was well, I'll tell you about my theory about the spirits, but if we think of John Dee, the magician to Queen Elizabeth I, he was the original 007.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the James Bond thing was related to. And again, think about it, that he also would have worked with the secrecy around and the Secret Service, and he wrote for Her Majesty's eyes, or for her eyes only, and all that kind of stuff. And that continues and is used by Ian Fleming, who works in naval intelligence. And notice the word intelligence. So intelligence is about the secret stuff that is done behind the scenes of power. And that intelligence includes communicating with angelic beings. That's so they're related. They're intelligences, and the intelligence community is doing it. And of course, John Dee was really the main man behind the development of the British Navy, because the Navy is always associated with this. And so when I hear about the Navy is telling us about their contacts with UFOs today, okay. Well,
Right.
Anyway, so intelligence is critical, and then you get artificial intelligence. Well, I mean, it's artificial to a certain degree, but the key word is that persistence of the notion of intelligence is back to that time and that period, and it's inherently associated with the occult. There's no question about this. So when they talk about increasing your intelligence, and same as O'Leary and all this about intelligence increase, you have to be, you're doing your space exploration and intelligence increase. Well, this ties in with the occult dimension, even linguistically, if you look at the things. So at the same time, we want to deny that you have any spiritual being. We want to dispirit you, and that's what Huxley and them were doing by trying to take spirit out of the dialogue. And if you look back at people like Suhrawardi, they're explaining that each individual has a double, a kind of the spiritual body, the man or woman of light, or some people would see it as the guardian angel. Well, we don't want any of that. We want to make sure that that's a superstition, regard it as a superstition. while we're engaged in communication with intelligences. And if you notice, most of the modern religions in America, Church of Scientology, Mormons, were founded by magicians who engaged with intelligences. That they were doing experiments to find treasure or whatever. So this thing is continuous, and it's through all the processes. I should say that I do have a fundamental critique of religious institutions, which is separate from religious or individuals that are spiritual or religious. So this is a point. I would fundamentally have a problem. Not say that it can't work, but we do have to be critical about religious institutions and the possibility that religious institutions can be taken over. And this is one of the objections to the Catholic Church. There's an argument from traditionalists that it's being taken over by. Anyway, so looking at, I think we've said this before, but I think the period from 1863 to 1963 was the crucial period. It was a period probably sensed by Steiner. He located a bit later, but it was in progress. Sensed by Pope Leo when he has his vision of Satan claiming that he'd take over the church in 100 years. Predicted in the Marian apparitions and the apparitions of the Virgin Mary that are accepted through that kind of scientific mechanism of the church, where she talks about the church being taken over by the kind of Antichrist. And 1863, 100 years before 1963, was associated with the start, really, of the telecommunications network and the international telecommunications network. And I've said, I believe that created the conditions for what we'd call the Antichrist, the system. That it was more the system which becomes the system of control, and that a lot of the prophecies were associated really with the system, or what the system would create that would control us, including capture of the. So this is the Virgin Mary appearing and saying that the church is being taken over, essentially, and ones that are accepted, the priesthood is being corrupt. So and then you have the apparition in Fatima with 70,000 people witnessing the miracle of the sun. They can't be dismissed that easy at the time, just before the Russian Revolution, talking about and the revelations associated with that. So we have a long history of both the manifestations of dark energy and the manifestations of light warnings about that. For example, most of the Marian apparitions in the world appeared in France. You might say Italy, but France is up the top. And that's also the site of most battlefields in the world. So most battles have taken in France. There's a connection between them. So the darkness kind of invites light in a spiritual sense. There's a competing force. Even John Liddy, who predicted that silicon and metal and nickel would be used, or would create a solid state entity that would run the world and control the world and suck nature into itself. He said there was also a competing force in the universe trying to prevent that. So we always have this duality that seems to exist. So as that manifests the darkness, there's always this bright thing. But we're constantly persuaded that it doesn't exist. It's not real, despite the fact that you have, say, with Fatima, even the people that were against it, the Freemasons, witnessed it and recorded it, and it was reported, photographed, and you can only come down to explanations that it was extraterrestrials or the Virgin. It was what it was claimed to be. I mean, there's no other, but it's not a normal occurrence. It's a supernatural, extraordinary occurrence, and associated with that was various warnings about it. So we have a load of evidence about this darkness, about spirits, and there's another funny thing. Although the big problem is ultramaterialism, both on a left and a right side, there is a curious connection, even in communism, and it was emphasized early on, a connection with Satanism, for example. And even if you look back at the early pictures of Trotsky and Lenin, there was a suggestion in their image that they were creating a diabolical image. And even in the train that Trotsky went around in. So there was a deeper, he was interested in occult things as well. So although they were ultra-materialist, there is a strange connection with the occult. And you would have to ask yourself, well, how can any group of people persist in the eradication of their fellow human beings with such gusto, with such consistency, with such bloodshed, without having something which is abnormal or supranormal in it? This blood element, this attraction to the shedding of blood, is in some way associated with with a very strong dark force. There's no question about that. It wouldn't be happening if people didn't want it to happen. You know, so we might think it's terrible. There's a lot of other people think it's not.
Right. And it's like the spirits of darkness have fallen upon mankind and infiltrated, through mind in a lot of
Yes.
ways, and through ideologies, through the belief systems, that a lot of what we've already talked about today. And I think it's just a true spiritual, a coming back home to within ourselves, to a true spiritual knowing of who we are, and aligning with our own, I would say, deeper morals and fundamental ideas that connect us. The perennial philosophies, like we talked about earlier. That to me feels like the only actual way a solution can kind of manifest itself. I mean, there isn't going to be a top-down approach where we are able to necessarily take out this system, right? There's no law that we can put in place right now within the system, because the system is controlled by by these people who are, it's been infiltrated. We'll say that. So it is only going to come from the ground up, as we already talked about. And I think the masses will turn if we ourselves turn, and we ourselves are able to actually integrate deeper wisdom and deeper foresight about what's coming down the pipeline. As it's very clear at this point, for anybody who has the eyes to see, or has been really starting to ask the deeper questions. And I'm not sure the full picture of the agenda is in sight for everybody yet, but there are certainly more people beginning to ask questions and beginning to recognize that what's taking place is not making a lot of sense. So we need to just continue to, I'd say, hash out all the different elements of, not being caught by the false prophets or false illusions, and the division and the distractions, because this system has an intelligence to it, as you already alluded to, that allows it to cover all the bases of where people might naturally go in response to a perceived threat or a perceived injustice. So it's really about coming back to ourselves, and instead of continuing to externalize, but in the same sense, finding the right balance to where we can continue to have these conversations and naturally come together in community. So there's a lot of, I would say, work that needs to be done, certainly. And I think really a lot of the people who buy into transhumanism, or they buy into ideologies that, or statism, whatever it may be, they're just kind of looking for a deeper sense of certainty or safety. And really, I think the only way to counteract that is to develop a deeper faith and a deeper knowing that we don't necessarily need that safety. We don't need to be taken care of in a lot of ways, and that deeper and freedom can only be achieved through self-actualization and realization of the spiritual consciousness, as opposed to something that is external and taken or granted, and all of these essentially breaking down the dependencies that has been infiltrated into our mind through this darkness, through this agenda. But I don't know. I think I'm still optimistic personally. Maybe I'm not optimistic, but I know you and I have both talked about this before. There's really no room for fear. So regardless of where anybody
No.
may be right now, especially after listening to this, I don't. Uh, I
Oh,
think
well, yeah.
there's.
Well, on that point, the key thing about spiritual traditions is that they're calculated
Yeah,
to oppose fear, and
yeah,
they're calculated to protect you against possession, against relinquishing of your sovereignty. That's what they grew up for. That's what their
yeah,
purpose is. They're calculated to protect your dignity, because the point is that structures will not necessarily do that. We've been shown time and time again, and we can't. The scale on which things can go wrong now is so big that we don't have a choice but to oppose, and you don't have a choice anyway. We do have to evolve. This is who we are, and the only way we avoid that is by allowing ourselves be possessed or to devolve, but possessed by an ideology or a spirit or an intelligence. And all the traditions emphasize creativity and compassion. The model of the universe is creativity and compassion. So the compassion is first for ourselves. If we don't have that compassion for ourselves, we can't do anything. Then the compassion extends to our neighbors, to the people around us, and to the world. And associated with that is the model of creativity. And this is what people like Tolkien, who was a Catholic, and C.S. Lewis, who was Church of Ireland, and later became Church of England via atheism and the occult and theism before he came back to it, through a long process of argumentation, including with Tolkien, and including when Tolkien convinced him about the historicity of Jesus, for example, was necessary to him. But they talked about secondary creation. So this is the idea that a human's job is to develop, to be creative in their own way, to mirror the divine creation. So it's creativity that is the power that humans have. So we have infinite creativity. Humans are brilliant at finding solutions to things, but we only find solutions when we're looking for them. So or we're aware of them. So the positive things are really about the compassionate spirit that we can spread, but also the creativity. We really have to think. For example, I've been saying recently that people should now begin to think, and again, it's not in a negative way, and this is empowering. When we begin to think in a constructive way, to think that if the argument is that the policy is to insert something in our body, the good people in the world should begin to develop countermeasures to be able to detect, for example, whether you have something in your body. I get a lot of people asking me, Evan, whether they have something inserted in the body, and I say I can't tell you. There's a lot of people believe that they have had things in their body, and I've no ability to determine whether that is, or whether a person is imagining things or whatever. But as it gets more and more significant, even from a business perspective, there's going to be a lot of people wanting to know, is there any foreign object in my body? Because people will be able to drop things in your drink and be able to get information about you. They'll be able to, they can drop it from the sky, they can do whatever. So if we begin to think about countermeasures, about how do we determine if there are, and obviously there are ways as well. I mean, these are created by science. The patents are published. We can tell what the mechanisms is for certain things, but we can also reverse engineer those processes, anticipate those processes, think of ways to counteract those, to interfere with the processes. Again, we're talking about non-violence, and I'm not encouraging anything to do anything illegal. But if you look at what the communists did, actually, when I was talking to a woman whose grandfather was a communist, and we had an interesting story because she believes in some way has some connection with this figure who was executed by the Nazis. I think they guillotined him, and she, funnily enough, has a mark on her neck which she thinks is related. It was an interesting story, but so I read the book in Swedish. He was Norwegian, but their job was to sabotage the Nazi movement. So that's a noble thing to do. But there will be, at certain stages, there will be similar movements again. And it doesn't, you know what I mean? In that case, the communists were the good guys, you know, so you can't make assumptions about, in fact, one of the reasons why some of these materialist, the communists are impacting on us is because they've worked harder at it. While people were sitting at home watching their popcorn, watching Friends, these were out having meetings and doing things. There's a kind of, Darwin would say, there's a kind of evolutionary thing about that. They just worked harder. The Trotskyites work harder than anybody else. They're like a cult in the way they operate, but they're dedicated to their cause. I don't think they're right. I think Trotsky ultimately wanted this transhumanism, and I think they're making a mistake about what they. But you can't deny that their commitment to the thing. So what I'm saying is, if we apply the same positive energy to the achievement of a goal, which is in the interest of other people in a deep sense, and recognize that the individual is not merely a material object, they're not merely an identity that's projected on them. And if we were committed to the deep values of creativity and compassion, it will always triumph. And there is a curious and remarkable recurrence in the descriptions of these beings, that they're in some way uncreative. Yeah. That this is a recurrent thing. Now, not that they're not intelligent, because people that engage and recognize that these beings are intelligent, very capable of manipulation, of operating and manipulating fear if they get access to it, but in their own way. But they're not creative in that sense, and they certainly can't resist superior spiritual beings. That is why people engage in the occult, call on the Judeo-Christian standards to help them. It's a bit absurd that Christians don't believe in Jesus anymore, but the occult people do, because they want protection to exercise power over the demonic world. It's a very strange thing that people don't really understand. So why don't good people utilize the spiritual entities that want to support them? Why don't they use their own spiritual consciousness, their own creativity, their own compassion, because they are powerful forces. Kindness is a powerful force. These things can change the world when we begin to see people as other people as spiritual beings, and see their identity as transcendent, as having that angelic nature, as opposed to seeing others as transactional and compartmentalizing them, reducing them, denigrating them, putting them into a box, trying to make them feel bad unnecessarily, trying to attribute blame to them that they don't have, trying to be unforgiving as the cancel culture is, utterly unforgiving in a way that the spiritual traditions are not. So we have to begin to play those. They're the big metaphorical guns that the good people have. They're very powerful forces, and they won't, in the long run, they won't be triumphed over, because it's impossible for the lesser force to triumph over the bigger force on that. It's just people may ally with the wrong side or the losing side in the thing. I mean, we don't want to do that. So don't not take it seriously. But it's a very positive message, and the positive messages of spiritual liberation. That fear is a consequence of buying into a narrative and an actuality which is intended and calculated to be fearful. So certainly, yeah, I don't intend to drift into any negative thing, but people do have to understand that it's a serious thing. In my view, they might say that's a whole lot of nonsense. He's a bit of an Irish nutter there, making all that kind of stuff up. But if you study the traditions, talk to people, it's a very real force, and they're more real than it's usually called in spiritual terms with a capital R for the real being the essential construction of our universe. And even the good scientists understand that their knowledge will always be incomplete. in 10,000 years, they still won't have the answer. They know that it's impossible mathematically to be able to explain something which is the sum and greater than the sum of its parts. They won't be able to do it. They'll be no closer to understand meaning. And these are the key words that people like Lewis and Tolkien focused on meaning and truth. And you could apply reason to one, but you had to apply the imagination in order to understand. So imagination is associated with a creativity. The imaginative faculty is a key element. Frederick Myers talked about the imaginal, and the imaginal for him was the imago, not the imago Dei, but the insect in the chrysalis as they come to the next stage. So we're at that stage. You can either spiritually stay in the chrysalis and turn into goo, or you can emerge into a new being. That's really the choice. That's the imaginal, and that imaginal also is linked to Henri Corbin, the imagination, the imaginal, which goes back to people, well, through Yeats was very big on that, and William Blake and Swedenborg and Jacob Boehme, and go back in time. This is the great gift that we have, which will provide solutions. We can attend to all these problems. Whatever technology they have can be reverse engineered. We can find superior technology. We can find, so that's again what the techno rebels have a role in this. So it's not a question about disillusionment. In fact, it's only when we talked about thinking about a master plan, it's only when you have a plan, a direction, a place where the boats are going, where the ships are going, a destination, a strategy, an awareness of tactics, an awareness of dangers on the way, an awareness of what storms might do, awareness what to do in those circumstances. Then you regain control of your destiny, that we focus on the things we have control over in our own little ship, and in a relationship with others, and in a general direction. And as we begin to get power, we also get the power then to speak it out to the world, to spell it out to the world, to oppose. It's because in battle or in fighting, or as you know, in your martial arts, that it's a bit like the eye of the tiger. It's only when people begin to realize there's a force against them that they become conscious of their own limitations. And in battle as well, their limitations will be exposed, and the consistency of the opposing force becomes clear. But if the person doesn't turn up for battle, well, then the person's understanding of their omnipotence will be allowed to go unchallenged. So part of the looking for a solution to and focusing on some plan, some simple proposition to draw different people together around some loose, uncapturable strategies will also begin to allow people to lift their hearts up to the goal that we need to focus on. And when you're focusing on a positive thing, your fear is less operative. Your energy can't be focusing on the fear that the kind of demonic ultra-materialist wants you to focus on. When we begin to, and also begin to challenge people that want to take our power away, because they're already taking legal powers away because we're letting them. There was a lot of things we could have done legally, but when you begin to get paralyzed with fear, you don't take action. So I think we can put ourselves into a different zone by our spiritual consciousness, which is creative, imaginative, and also in a positive sense, combative. It's the same thing when you overcome your fear in a ring or in whatever contest. When you step in there, well, then you begin to empower yourself, and a different element, you move to a higher level. And also you begin to improve your technique, apply your technique, understand what the opposing force is. We have to get into that idea and get into an active, expressive, communicative, creative role, which is compassion in the tradition of the spiritual warrior.
Right. Absolutely. And letting go of the indecisiveness or
Yes,
paralysis that may come from,
that's
I
right.
think there's almost like a collective freeze response to some of it. And
Yes,
you
yeah,
take
that's
it
right.
in, and fight or flight tends to be what's dominant in the discourse, but there's the freeze as well. And I think
Mm.
for a lot of people, maybe that was an initial reaction, but we have to have the willingness to step out of that and then take the action that we know we need to take and allow it to guide us forward versus versus running the other way or burying our heads in the sand or just allowing us uh, to watch all of it unfold without any sort of action or any sort of plan or strategy. And I think it brings, as we were talking about earlier, I think it brings a deeper sense of meaning and purpose to um, the times that we are in. If a lot of people are asking, why is this taking place? We don't necessarily need a why, but I mean, we can look at the how and we can look at what's going on. The why is simply because it is, and here we are now. So what are we going to do about it? So I think that in itself is a deep message of empowerment and a reclamation of our abilities and who it is that we are. Because when the pendulum swings so far one way, uh, you could make the argument that uh, it was a necessary duel with the darkness so that we could unlock further levels of who it is that we are. And
Yeah, and that's Paul Check, I think, would certainly have that view. And actually, I was listening to an exorcist who had a similar view again, that there is something in the facing of these forces that we either invite or
Mhm.
must deal with or reflect back on that will ultimately determine our development. And as you're saying that uh, about decisiveness, you know as well that in a lot of the martial arts works from Japan, etc., became important in spiritual tradition, and
Mhm.
people extrapolated uh, Lukashi and all those that and the Book of Five Rings, and they extrapolated from the martial tradition into spiritual tradition. So that point about decisiveness is very, very important. Or you might meet the Buddha, but you had to be able to defend yourself as well at the same point, and the ability, the necessity to be able to commit yourself to a decision when you have made it, when it's a matter of life and death. And with their context, it could have been a stroke in less than a second that would kill you. So you really had to be in the moment and apply the Zen mind. And also, as you're saying that, I was thinking back on Sun Tzu and the Art of War. Actually, they explain a lot of the strategies, about breaking food supplies and all that. It's out
Mhm.
of we can find out and anticipate. And another person in this zone, a person who hated C.S. Lewis, was Ayn Rand. And I've said before that if you look at Atlas Shrugged, where the millionaires are withdrawing and society is breaking down, they're participating, the capitalists really, in the breakdown of society. Now, there's a question about whether they're done by opposing forces, but the other implication is that this was a kind of blueprint for the capitalist destruction of their own system so they could get more power. This is a subtext that some people saw in Ayn Rand. But there is a history. A lot of Taoism came when the Taoists retreated to the mountains to escape the kind of imperial government, and there they developed their spiritual tradition. But they probably got there in the first place because of their spiritual tradition. So these people have that experience, and their efforts to explain the Tao were also efforts to explain survival mechanisms and to oppose imperial systems. So this is a long this battle between empire and individual is an ancient battle that's manifested or behind the Tao Te Ching. It's behind Christianity. It's in all the other traditions. The emperor. It's in the Bhagavad Gita, and in relation to the war, and that could be internally as well. So all it happens again and again. There's nothing new, nothing to see here. But the difference is that we're in a context where what can be done technologically to the human consciousness is a critical. We're moving into a different dimension, and as you said, there's two paths. There's the spiritual path, or there's the slavery path. Right. And I know which one I'm taking. Thank you very much. Right. Whatever, if people, and it may be that the vast majority of people go the other way. So when we're talking about a mass movement, it may only be mass on a limited scale, but I think there's a growing amount of people that will commit themselves to the. It will be mass eventually, and there will be a growing amount of people that will begin to commit themselves. I can see it happening already, even in the last couple of years. And I don't have to convince people as much that there are nasty people out there that think we're like animals, because they're telling us, which is great. I'm delighted. I'm delighted for Yuval Noah Harari, because he's making a case that when I say it, they don't believe me. When I said it, they just don't. People are, well, one, they're hypnotized, and two, they think you're a bit crazy when you're saying things like that. So I wish that, man, maybe you should invite him on.
Yeah, right.
But so really, they've made the case. I'm delighted that they're putting it out there. I hope they put it out more out and tell people how nasty they think they are, and it will. Well, people won't have an excuse to say, "Well, I didn't know." And if if they want to do all those bread and circuses, let them have their donuts and entertainment.
Right, exactly. They can choose that path if they will, or they have
Good
free
luck
will.
To them, yeah.
Well, and maybe they won't have free will if they choose that path, but in the meantime, they still have the free will to choose it. So it's, what can we really do in that sense? But so James, do you have any other final points or thoughts to expand upon what we've been talking about here, or
just the last point, because I can see in a reflection here, the picture behind me, which was a reference to Carl Jung talking about a fundamental relationship, which is useful to think about as well. It's part of the issue, is about the anima and the animus. He, in this context, was talking about the figure of the senex, which is the old man or woman, and the young woman. And this is a crucial relationship in society. So we're often talking about the role of women in society or whatever, but it's really in the terms of the anima and animus in us. And they have to be balanced. They have to be in proper relationship. It's no good talking about one or the other. And you see this archetype, which is, and even that relationship again and again in old pictures. I've seen it more and more when I look back. And you have this male figure, which is bringing the light, and it represents the kind of Gandalf magician, the same as the hermit in tarot. It's a kind of archetypal figure who should be kind of clear and give us direction. But in the Red Book, Jung is suggesting that this figure has to have a good relationship with the young woman, who represents fertility, growth, and all different elements. It could be reason and intuition, whatever you want to call it. It represents a number of things. And we all have these figures in us. So there's a requirement. So this is when, again, thinking about Peterson and role models, and Peterson and Tyson Fury or whoever. These are not really, we can't look for them for figures outside. These are figures internally in us, in the anima and animus. And they must both develop in their own way. The wise aspect of us who needs or can see the value of structure and of clarity and of light needs to operate, or it could be Apollonian and Dionysian, needs to operate with the creative, growing, yin aspect, yin yang, whatever. So that duality is an important aspect in understanding, again, what the state of our minds is, our individual minds. And we have to and also because otherwise, if you look at Jung's student, Marie-Louise von Franz, she explained how this affects relationships. For example, how if the man projects the anima onto a woman, then you get this odd relationship. It's about how we see the world. So we have to get some basic awareness. I know you're interested in the tarot. We have to get some basic awareness of these archetypal figures as well, and try and interpret the world as well, internally and externally, and try and make sense and apply it to this bigger issue on a global scale now, with all the different forces, and begin to identify different elements, different archetypes, and understand what we're against and what's in us and what's against us within inside, and to get as far as we can that balance in us, so that those figures are in a good relationship. Because the suggestion was, if there's a good relationship with the younger woman, the feminine aspect of us, well, then we'll have a healthy relationship. If not, that figure transforms into something like Salome was his manifestation. Salome, who will have the head cut off John the Baptist, that's the difference between. And there was a deep idea in that. So as we're thinking about this movement, we have to begin to employ the range of knowledge from all these ideas about archetypes to begin to understand, the operation of the field and the big platform that we're dealing with. That was the last point. But as always, thank you very much for your patience, your inputs, your direction, and the synergistic relationship in this ongoing discussion. So I appreciate as always. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, no, and thank you, James. Absolutely. I was going to say, I feel like you just opened up a whole nother line of discussion with the last point. I'm like, oh, there's so much we could go down in that one. But I mean, that just goes to show the continual evolution and need for discussion around these topics, and how much it all interconnects. And we can look to the great works for inspiration, not just inspiration, knowledge, wisdom, and solutions that'll emerge naturally as we start putting all these pieces together and really connecting the dots. So, I'm looking forward to the next conversation and, what we end up uncovering. Coming into this one, but again, we had a game plan. Don't never know exactly where it's going to go, but it as always, it flows beautifully. So, and as we continue to see the agenda roll out, I know there will be more to unpack and uncover and explore. As the
but
time...
we've started to put out. Let's put out a kind of begin to a framework, or just the idea of it, or even an option on the table as well, so that other people don't. And the idea that us individuals can do something and be active and employ the insights that we get from different things in a positive vortex. So absolutely. And be optimistic. I don't ever want to come across as anything less than positive or full of beans or enthusiastic.
Absolutely. I'm right there with you on that. So James.
And of course, enthusiasm means with God. That's where the word comes from. So
all right.
Thanks for
I didn't know the etymology on that one. I like it though. That's the true meaning of enthusiasm. Okay, I like that. I like that. Now, okay, that makes me enthusiastic, I suppose, about the word itself.
It's a good word.
I love it.
Okay, I look forward to our next conversation. Thanks very much, as always.
Absolutely, James, and thank you for the time and the in-depth insight. And I encourage all the listeners to check out your books as well. And, Plantation of the Automatons. I'm still not done with it. It's long. It's a long book.
And thanks to anybody that has survived here till the end as well.
Yeah. And I think it's anybody who's interested in your work further, head on over to your website, because you have a wide range of interviews on there. And your book connects, it provides a lot of connecting of the dots further, and a lot of research and backdrop on a lot of what we're talking about as well. So a wealth of knowledge in there. So I would encourage everybody to check that out. Thanks. But thank you to all the listeners for tuning in, going through this marathon with us, and we'll see you all on the next episode.